Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Documentary. Tonight we're going to step into a part of ancient Egypt that's usually hinted at, politely translated, or quietly left out. Because behind the gold masks and temple hymns, the pharaoh's private life was also a political weapon. Rumors could topple reputations, scandals could reshape dynasties, and what later writers called perversion often says as much about the storyteller as it does about the king. If you enjoy calm, well-sourced history told in a way you can actually trust, feel free to subscribe. And now, let's slow down and look carefully at the most perverted pharaohs in history, and what that word really means when we're talking about Egypt. Before we name anyone, we need a simple rule. Ancient Egypt did not think in modern categories. Perversion is a loaded, modern label. Egyptians wrote about order, balance, fertility, legitimacy, and the stability of the state. Sex could be sacred, comedic, administrative, or dangerous depending on context. A king's marriages were not only personal, they were treaties, succession plans, and public theater. And when later Egyptians or Greek and Roman writers wanted to stain a ruler's memory, accusations about lust, strange habits, or improper partners were an easy way to do it. So what we're really studying is a mix of documented court practice, religious symbolism, propaganda, and rumor that survived because it was useful, memorable, or scandalous. Start with the most fundamental shock to modern ears: royal incest, especially sibling marriage. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not simply a man with a crown. He was a divine office, tied to gods whose unions were sometimes within the family, Osiris and Isis being the most famous. Royal women carried legitimacy. Royal bloodlines were political assets. In some periods, marrying a sister or half-sister was a way to keep inheritance concentrated and rival families out. It's tempting to call this perverted, but in Egyptian terms it was often presented as sacred continuity and dynastic strategy. The discomfort we feel is real, but it's our reaction to the collision between modern social norms and an ancient system built around divine kingship and hereditary power. That framework becomes especially important in the late New Kingdom, when the royal family begins to show signs, at least in what we can infer from mummies and family trees, of tight intermarriage that may have increased health problems over generations. The most famous case in popular culture is Tutankhamun, whose parentage appears connected to close-kin unions common in the royal house of the period. But Tutankhamun himself is not remembered as a sexual libertine. He's remembered as a boy king trapped between ideological storms. The perversion here isn't about salacious behavior. It's about a political system so obsessed with divine legitimacy that it narrowed its own genetic options, and then tried to hide the consequences behind ritual and monumental art. This is one of the quiet tragedies of monarchy. The body of the ruler becomes a symbol the state cannot afford to admit is fragile. If we want a pharaoh whose reputation was shaped by whispers, we have to go back much earlier, to the Old Kingdom and the murky, half-lit border between story and record. One name that surfaces in later tradition is Neferkare, often linked by historians to Pepi II. In a famous tale preserved in later texts, a king is described slipping out at night to visit a favored man, an official named Seisnet. The story is not explicit in the way modern audiences sometimes expect, but it is unmistakably meant to suggest secrecy and improper intimacy. Improper, at least by the standards the storyteller wants to project. Here's the key. This tale survives not because we can confirm the king's private life, but because it reveals what later Egyptians found politically useful to insinuate. A ruler who appears to abandon public duty for private desire becomes a moral lesson. The king who should embody order instead indulges himself. Whether the event happened is less certain than the fact that the rumor functioned as criticism, and criticism was remembered. This pattern repeats across Egyptian history. Scandal is rarely preserved as a neutral report. It's preserved as a tool. In a world where the pharaoh's image was managed through temples, festivals, and carved proclamations, rumor offered an alternate channel, one that could be sharper precisely because it couldn't be easily refuted with official stone. And because Egyptian kingship was moral as well as administrative, the most effective rumors were those that implied the king was ruled by appetite rather than by Mot, the principle of right order. Now consider the Amarna period, dominated by Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted a religious revolution centered on the Aten. If you're looking for a ruler who inspired centuries of speculation about deviance, Akhenaten is an obvious magnet. His art style broke traditional forms. The royal family is shown with elongated features, intimate domestic scenes, and a softness that unsettled later tastes. Modern viewers sometimes project sexuality onto that imagery, reading it as evidence of bodily abnormality, fetish, or private excess. But the safest historical reading is simpler and more interesting. Akhenaten used the body as theology. The royal image was reshaped to communicate a new cosmic relationship between the king, the son's power, and the family as a sacred unit. The intimacy in the art is not necessarily a bedroom confession. It may be propaganda, presenting the royal household as the living center of a new religious order. Yet even if the art isn't perverted, it was certainly polarizing. After Akhenaten's death, much of his project was dismantled, and the memory of Amarna became a cautionary tale, an era when the king seemed to place personal vision above inherited balance. In that context, later insinuations about the king's strange private nature were almost inevitable, because strange was the category into which his entire reign was filed. If Akhenaten is the pharaoh of religious and aesthetic scandal, then the later Ramesside age gives us a different kind, the scandal of the royal household as a political battleground. Under Ramesses III, the court was enormous, the stakes were high, and palace life included competing queens, factions, and succession fears. The most famous episode is what modern historians call the harem conspiracy, a plot involving members of the royal household and officials who sought to place an alternative prince on the throne. Here, sex and power are inseparable, not because we're peering into prurient detail, but because the harem, better understood as the women's quarters and its administrative network, was a major political institution. Relationships within it could create alliances, grievances, and opportunities. In later retellings, this kind of intrigue becomes fertile ground for moral language. The idea that indulgence and luxury rot the state from inside. But the historical lesson is cooler and more structural. When a ruler's household becomes a miniature state with resources, bureaucrats, and rival claims, private life stops being private. It becomes national security. Then there's the case of sheer fertility as reputation, the pharaoh as a man whose sexual life is remembered mostly as arithmetic. Ramesses II is a classic example. His long reign and immense family became part of his legend. Dozens of royal children, multiple wives, diplomatic marriages. This is not perversion so much as empire building through marriage and lineage. Yet to later audiences, especially outside Egypt, this can read as excess. A king surrounded by women and heirs, a household that looks like indulgence. But again, the ancient logic is political. Children were insurance policies. Marriages created networks of loyalty. And the king's virility was not merely personal. It was symbolic proof that the gods still favored Egypt's stability. In royal ideology, potency could be presented as a public good. To see how the label perverted changes with cultural distance, move forward to the Ptolemaic dynasty, when Greek rulers governed Egypt as pharaohs after Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies famously practiced sibling marriage in a way that startled many Greek observers, even though Egypt had precedent for it in royal ideology. Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II are often discussed because their marriage blended Egyptian sacred kingship with Hellenistic dynastic strategy. To some ancient critics, this was monstrous. To the dynasty, it was consolidation. When Roman writers later described Egyptian courts, they often leaned into moral shock, painting the palace as exotic, decadent, and erotically charged. Those portrayals helped Romans define themselves as disciplined by contrast. So when a later source calls a pharaoh perverted, we always need to ask, are we hearing about behavior, or are we hearing about someone else's political and cultural prejudice? And that question brings us to the most important point of all. If you watch history long enough, you start to notice a pattern. When a ruler is hated, their bedroom becomes a courtroom. Accusations about lust, strange partners, or taboo practices appear most readily when the historical record is contested. When legitimacy is shaky, when reforms are unpopular, or when successors need a villain to justify a return to normal. Ancient Egypt is no exception. The pharaoh's body was a symbol of the state. So stories about the pharaoh's desires were never only gossip. They were arguments about what Egypt should be. So what do we do with a title like the most perverted pharaohs in history? We treat it as an invitation to examine power honestly, without turning the past into a cheap spectacle. Yes, there were practices that modern audiences find disturbing. Yes, there were courts where luxury and intimacy overlapped with policy. Yes, there were rumors, some possibly grounded, many certainly exaggerated. But the deeper story is about how monarchy weaponizes family, fertility, and image. In Egypt, sex could be sacred legitimacy, strategic alliance, or moral accusation depending on who held the chisel, who controlled the papyrus, and who survived to tell the tale. And in the next part, we'll slow down even further and look at how Egyptian religion, temple economies, and royal succession made certain scandals almost inevitable, especially in periods of crisis, when a single whisper could do what an army could not, change what people believed about their king. When we look more closely at how religion shaped royal behavior, the line between sacred duty and later accusations of excess becomes even clearer. Egyptian kingship was built on the idea that the pharaoh maintained Ma'at, the cosmic balance that kept the Nile flowing, the crops growing, and the gods satisfied. Fertility was not merely agricultural, it was theological. The king's vitality symbolized the health of the land. Temple reliefs sometimes depicted the pharaoh in ritual acts connected to renewal, including symbolic unions with goddesses who represented territory, order, or divine favor. To a modern viewer, such imagery can appear sensual or even provocative, but within Egyptian cosmology, these scenes were metaphors for stability and regeneration. That religious framework also explains why accusations of sexual misconduct could be politically devastating. If the king's body symbolized order, then portraying that body as uncontrolled suggested chaos. A pharaoh depicted as ruled by appetite rather than discipline was, by definition, failing at his most sacred obligation. This is why stories like the nocturnal visits attributed to Neferkare carried weight. Even if exaggerated, they implied that the king's priorities were inverted, private indulgence replacing public vigilance. The Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom provide further examples of how the royal household could become a site of tension. Royal women were not passive figures. Great royal wives, secondary wives, and royal daughters held estates, commanded servants, and sometimes acted as regents. Their proximity to succession made them politically significant. When later texts refer to intrigue inside the palace, especially within what modern writers loosely call the harem, they are describing a structured institution with economic and administrative power. In such an environment, alliances could be forged through intimacy, and resentment could grow quietly behind ceremonial walls. The conspiracy against Ramesses III illustrates this dynamic with unusual clarity. Court documents record trials of individuals accused of plotting to elevate a rival heir. While the surviving texts are formal and restrained, they show that factions inside the royal household had both motive and access. Later retellings often sensationalize the story, suggesting decadence and moral decay. Yet what the documents actually reveal is a bureaucratic response to a political crisis. The scandal was not primarily sexual. It was dynastic. Still, because it originated within the women's quarters and involved personal relationships, it became fertile ground for moral language in later memory. Another figure frequently drawn into discussions of perversion is Hatshepsut, though in a very different way. As a female pharaoh who adopted full royal titulary and iconography, she disrupted expectations. Some later hostility toward her memory, including the erasure of certain monuments, may have stemmed from political recalibration under her successors. Yet modern sensationalism sometimes reframes her reign in terms of hidden relationships or supposed improprieties. The evidence for such claims is thin. What we see instead is a ruler carefully constructing legitimacy in a system that was overwhelmingly male. The impulse to sexualize or scandalize her story tells us more about later anxieties than about her governance. In the Ptolemaic period, the blending of Greek and Egyptian customs intensified outsider commentary. Sibling marriage among the Ptolemies was both a continuation of earlier Egyptian royal ideology and a strategy to secure dynastic continuity in a foreign land. Greek observers, accustomed to different norms, often reacted with discomfort. Roman authors later amplified that discomfort, portraying Egyptian courts as morally exotic. Cleopatra VII, though technically Macedonian Greek, inherited this layered reputation. Roman propaganda painted her as dangerously seductive, a ruler whose personal relationships destabilized empires. Yet Egyptian sources emphasize her political intelligence and ritual role as pharaoh. Again, sexuality became a narrative device in struggles for power. It is also worth noting that ancient Egyptian humor itself included sexual themes. Ostraca and informal sketches sometimes depict exaggerated or comic scenarios involving gods, animals, and humans. These artifacts show that sexuality was not always cloaked in solemnity. It could be playful, symbolic, or satirical. However, the existence of humor does not automatically translate into evidence of widespread royal excess. The everyday creativity of artisans and scribes should not be confused with the lived behavior of kings. Over time, the reputations of certain pharaohs hardened into simplified caricatures. A long reign with many wives became decadence. A religious reform became eccentric obsession. A palace conspiracy became proof of corruption. But when we return to the primary evidence, inscriptions, administrative papyri, temple reliefs, we find a more structured reality. Egyptian kingship was conservative at its core. It valued continuity, ritual correctness, and visible piety. Deviations were remembered precisely because they threatened that stability. Perhaps the most revealing pattern is how often allegations surface after a ruler's death. Successors had incentives to reshape memory. If a new dynasty wished to distance itself from a predecessor, moral critique was a powerful tool. Portraying an earlier king as morally flawed justified reforms and reinforced the narrative of restoration. In that sense, stories of perverted pharaohs functioned as political commentary embedded in cultural memory. So when we examine these rulers through a modern lens, we have to separate three layers. First, the documented practices rooted in religious and dynastic logic. Second, the rumors and literary tales that served moral instruction or political rivalry. And third, the later classical and modern reinterpretations shaped by entirely different cultural expectations. Only by distinguishing these layers can we approach something close to historical balance. In the end, ancient Egypt's most controversial pharaohs were not simply men or women driven by appetite. They were occupants of an office that fused divinity, family, and state into a single body. Their marriages, heirs, and even their artistic representations were strategic instruments. To reduce them to scandal is to miss the larger mechanism of power that made such scandals meaningful in the first place. And as we move further into the later dynasties and the gradual transformation of Egypt under foreign rule, we'll see how the language of excess and moral decline becomes even more pronounced, especially as external observers reinterpret Egyptian kingship through their own cultural fears and ambitions. As Egypt moved into periods of foreign domination, particularly under Persian and later Macedonian rule, the tone of commentary about its rulers shifted in noticeable ways. Outside observers often lacked the religious framework that made Egyptian royal customs intelligible within their original setting. What had once been understood as divine symbolism could now be recast as strangeness. What had functioned as dynastic necessity could be reframed as moral weakness. This shift is especially visible in Greek and Roman writings, which frequently described Eastern courts, Egypt included, as luxurious, indulgent, and overly sensual. It is important to understand that these portrayals were rarely neutral. Greek historians wrote for Greek audiences. Roman historians wrote for Roman citizens. When they depicted Egyptian rulers as excessive or morally lax, they were often reinforcing a contrast: disciplined West versus decadent East. This rhetorical pattern appears again and again in classical literature. It was a convenient narrative device, especially when Rome sought to justify military intervention or political dominance. Cleopatra VII provides the clearest example of how reputation can eclipse complexity. Though not ethnically Egyptian, she ruled as pharaoh and embraced Egyptian religious imagery. Roman sources, particularly those aligned with Octavian, later Augustus, emphasized her personal relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She was portrayed as dangerously alluring, manipulative, and morally corrupting. Yet Egyptian inscriptions and coinage present a ruler engaged in administrative reform, economic stabilization, and strategic diplomacy. The seductress image proved politically useful to her enemies. It reduced a geopolitical struggle to a morality play centered on desire. This pattern mirrors earlier dynamics within Egypt itself. When a king's authority weakened, whether through military setbacks or economic strain, critics found it effective to suggest that private indulgence distracted him from public duty. In societies where the ruler embodied cosmic order, moral language carried extraordinary weight. Even without detailed evidence, the mere suggestion of impropriety could undermine confidence. We also see how royal excess becomes associated with decline in later historiography. The final centuries of independent Egyptian rule are sometimes framed as eras of decadence preceding inevitable conquest. Yet, archaeological evidence often reveals continued temple construction, active trade networks, and functioning bureaucracies. The image of decline is frequently sharpened by moral storytelling rather than administrative collapse. In other words, narratives of perversion or indulgence can simplify complex historical transitions. Another factor to consider is the role of monumental silence. Egyptian kings carefully curated their public image. Temples and tombs rarely admit weakness. They project strength, piety, and divine favor. When something scandalous did occur, it was unlikely to be carved into stone. As a result, historians must rely on indirect sources, legal documents, damaged inscriptions, later literary tales, and external accounts. Each source carries its own bias. The absence of explicit confession should not be mistaken for proof of innocence, but neither should rumor be mistaken for fact. Modern scholarship approaches these stories cautiously. Advances in archaeology, epigraphy, and even forensic analysis of mummies have refined our understanding of royal life. We can now trace family relationships more accurately, identify health conditions, and contextualize artistic shifts. What often emerges is not lurid spectacle, but a portrait of rulers navigating intense pressures, maintaining divine legitimacy, managing extended households, producing heirs, and defending borders. The fascination with labeling certain pharaohs as perverted reveals something about contemporary audiences as well. There is a natural curiosity about the private lives of powerful figures. Scandal humanizes rulers who might otherwise feel distant. Yet when studying ancient Egypt, we must remember that the categories of morality, propriety, and deviance were shaped by a worldview very different from our own. Practices that seem shocking today may have been normalized within a specific theological and political logic. Ultimately, the enduring stories about Egypt's most controversial pharaohs tell us less about hidden chambers and more about visible power. They show how sexuality, fertility, and family could become symbols in larger ideological struggles. They remind us that reputation is a battleground long after a ruler's death, and they encourage us to read carefully, distinguishing between evidence carved in stone, accusations written in papyrus, and dramatic retellings crafted centuries later. In the closing moments of our exploration, we're left with a quieter conclusion. Ancient Egypt was neither a realm of unchecked decadence nor a sterile world devoid of human complexity. It was a civilization that fused divinity and monarchy so completely that even the most intimate aspects of a ruler's life carried political meaning. To understand its so-called most perverted pharaohs is not to indulge in scandal, but to recognize how power shapes memory, and how memory, in turn, shapes history. If we step back and look across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, a pattern becomes increasingly clear. The pharaoh's private life was never truly private. It was absorbed into theology, law, inheritance, diplomacy, and myth. When later writers chose to emphasize sexuality, especially in exaggerated or moralizing ways, they were not simply recounting events. They were interpreting power through the lens of their own cultural anxieties. Consider how succession worked in practical terms. Egypt did not always follow a strict, predictable rule of inheritance. While the son of a great royal wife was often favored, circumstances could complicate matters. Multiple wives meant multiple potential heirs. Political alliances shaped marriage choices. Foreign princesses entered the court through diplomatic agreements. Each union carried implications for legitimacy. In such a system, rumors about intimacy were never trivial. They could call into question the identity of the next king. This helps explain why royal women appear so prominently in moments of controversy. A queen's influence could extend beyond ceremony. She might oversee estates, advise the king, or act as regent for a young successor. If rival factions formed around competing maternal lines, tension within the palace was inevitable. When conflict erupted, later accounts often framed it in personal terms: jealousy, seduction, betrayal, because those narratives were more vivid and morally resonant than bureaucratic disputes over land or titles. The religious dimension deepened this dynamic. Pharaohs were not merely political leaders. They were divine intermediaries. Temple rituals emphasized renewal, rebirth, and generative power. Annual festivals sometimes included symbolic reenactments of sacred unions between gods. The king's participation in these ceremonies reinforced his role as guarantor of fertility and abundance. To modern eyes, such rituals may appear theatrical or sensual, but within Egyptian belief, they were essential performances of cosmic maintenance. When rulers deviated from established tradition, suspicion followed. Akhenaten's religious revolution is again instructive. His shift toward exclusive devotion to the Aten disrupted entrenched priesthoods and economic networks tied to older cults. Resistance to his reforms likely took many forms, including subtle attacks on his character. Artistic innovations, elongated bodies, intimate family scenes, provided fertile ground for later speculation. Yet what seems unconventional may have been carefully designed theological symbolism rather than evidence of private eccentricity. We should also consider the mechanics of memory. After a controversial reign, later kings sometimes engaged in deliberate erasure. Names were removed from monuments. Statues were recarved. In extreme cases, entire reigns were omitted from king lists. This process, often called damnatio memoriae in Roman contexts, had Egyptian parallels. When a ruler's image was dismantled, so too was control over their story. Rumor could fill the gaps left by destroyed inscriptions. Over time, narrative replaced nuance. The appeal of sensational labels today reflects a similar impulse. Modern audiences are drawn to the hidden, the forbidden, the scandalous. Titles emphasizing perversion promise revelation. Yet responsible history asks a quieter question. What structural forces made certain accusations believable? Why did particular stories endure while others faded? When we examine the evidence, we often find that what appears shocking in isolation makes more sense within a broader institutional framework. Even the physical evidence of royal mummies, sometimes cited in discussions of excess or abnormality, must be interpreted carefully. Health conditions visible in remains can result from genetics, diet, environment, or ritual treatment after death. It is tempting to draw dramatic conclusions, but scientific analysis typically reveals complexity rather than moral narrative. The body of a pharaoh, like his monuments, carries layers of meaning that resist simple explanation. In the end, the phrase "most perverted pharaohs" tells us as much about storytelling as it does about history. It compresses centuries of cultural practice, political rivalry, and religious symbolism into a single provocative frame. Yet when we slow down, as we've done here, the frame widens. We see rulers balancing divine expectation with human limitation. We see courts negotiating succession under intense pressure. We see later historians reshaping memory to serve their own eras. Ancient Egypt endures not because it was scandalous, but because it was structured. Its institutions were remarkably stable, its religious imagination expansive, and its artistic record unparalleled. The controversies that survive are threads in a much larger tapestry. To understand them is to appreciate the complexity of a civilization that bound power, piety, and family into one enduring idea: that the king's life, in all its dimensions, was inseparable from the fate of the state. And perhaps that is the calm truth behind the sensational headline. The pharaohs were not caricatures of excess. They were human beings occupying a divine office, navigating systems that amplified every strength and every flaw. Their reputations, shaped by allies and enemies alike, continue to evolve as new evidence emerges. What remains constant is our fascination, not with scandal alone, but with the enduring mystery of how power defines morality across time. As we bring this exploration to its final stretch, it's worth reflecting on why certain pharaohs continue to attract the label of excess while others, equally complex, do not. The answer often lies in visibility. The rulers who left behind unusual art, disrupted tradition, faced internal crisis, or became entangled with foreign powers are the ones whose reputations invite reinterpretation. Stability, by contrast, is rarely sensational. Ancient Egypt's longevity depended on predictability. Ritual calendars were precise. Temple hierarchies were defined. Succession, though sometimes contested, followed recognizable patterns. When a pharaoh appeared to disrupt that rhythm, whether through religious reform, unconventional iconography, or controversial alliances, anxiety followed. That anxiety frequently took moral form. It is easier to accuse a ruler of indulgence than to explain structural change in agricultural taxation or temple endowments. Moral language travels faster than administrative detail. There is also the matter of translation. Egyptian texts survive in fragments, carved in stone or written in hieratic and demotic scripts that require careful interpretation. Words related to intimacy, desire, or misconduct do not always map neatly onto modern English categories. A term that might imply impropriety in one context could simply indicate affection or ritual symbolism in another. Over time, translations can harden into assumptions, especially when filtered through earlier generations of scholarship influenced by Victorian moral frameworks. What one century considered scandalous, another may regard as culturally embedded practice. We should also remember that Egyptian society, like any other, contained a range of behaviors and attitudes. Not every marriage was political. Not every rumor was invented. Human relationships in any royal court were complicated. Yet the survival of evidence is uneven. Monumental inscriptions preserve triumph and piety. Administrative papyri preserve disputes and logistics. Literary tales preserve cautionary themes. When these sources intersect, historians must weigh probability, bias, and silence together. The enduring fascination with royal intimacy speaks to a broader human impulse. Power magnifies curiosity. The more elevated a figure becomes, the more their personal life seems to promise hidden insight into public events. In Egypt, where the king was a living god, that curiosity intensifies. If the pharaoh embodied cosmic balance, then any hint of imbalance becomes symbolically charged. This symbolic weight is what allowed later writers, both Egyptian and foreign, to frame political transitions as moral dramas. And yet, despite centuries of storytelling, the archaeological record often restores proportion. Temples continued to function. Trade routes adapted. Agricultural cycles persisted. Even during periods remembered as decadent or chaotic, daily life for most Egyptians followed familiar rhythms. The gap between sensational narrative and lived continuity is striking. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by dramatic personalities, but by enduring institutions. When we examine the so-called most perverted pharaohs, what we ultimately uncover is not a gallery of moral extremes, but a series of case studies in how authority interacts with culture. We see how divine ideology can justify practices that later generations question. We see how succession politics can transform private relationships into public crises. We see how foreign observers project their own values onto unfamiliar systems. And we see how modern media, in search of compelling headlines, can compress nuance into provocation. None of this diminishes the complexity of ancient Egypt. If anything, it enhances it. A civilization capable of sustaining monumental architecture, intricate theology, and administrative continuity for millennia was also capable of internal debate, adaptation, and narrative reinvention. Its rulers were not immune to controversy, but controversy itself operated within a highly structured world. So perhaps the most responsible conclusion is this: when we encounter dramatic labels attached to historical figures, especially from distant cultures, our first task is not to accept or reject them outright. It is to ask what purpose those labels served, and for whom. In the case of Egypt's pharaohs, accusations of excess often reveal more about shifting power dynamics than about hidden chambers behind palace walls. And that is where the calm study of history proves its value. It allows us to move beyond spectacle and into structure, beyond rumor and into record. The pharaohs remain compelling not because they were scandalous, but because they ruled at the intersection of divinity and humanity. Their lives, interpreted and reinterpreted across centuries, remind us that power is always observed, always judged, and rarely remembered without distortion. Thank you for spending this time exploring ancient Egypt in depth. If you found this thoughtful approach helpful, consider subscribing for more long-form documentaries that trade noise for clarity. Until next time, we'll let the Nile flow quietly in the background and leave the echoes of rumor where they belong, as part of history's long, complicated conversation. Before we close completely, There is one final layer worth considering: how modern archaeology has quietly reshaped many of the assumptions that once fueled sensational claims. Over the last century, excavations in the Valley of the Kings, Amarna, Saqqara, and other major sites have provided a clearer picture of daily royal life. What emerges from these discoveries is not an atmosphere of constant indulgence, but one of ritual precision, administrative oversight, and careful image management. Take the layout of royal palaces and temple complexes. These were not designed primarily as spaces of private luxury in the modern sense. They were administrative hubs, ceremonial stages, and sacred environments. Even the so-called harem areas, often dramatized in popular retellings, functioned as structured residential and economic units. Women living their managed estates, textile production, and household staff. The term itself can mislead, suggesting an exoticized fantasy rather than an organized institution embedded within the state. Similarly, tomb decoration reveals priorities that were spiritual and ideological rather than indulgent. Pharaohs invested immense resources into securing their afterlife. Scenes carved into tomb walls emphasize offerings, journeys through the underworld, and union with deities. If these rulers were defined by unrestrained personal excess, we might expect their self-presentation to reflect it. Instead, they consistently foreground order, reverence, and continuity. This does not mean that royal courts were free of personal drama. Any extended family with immense wealth and influence will generate rivalry. But rivalry alone does not equal decadence. It reflects the human reality within a system of concentrated power. The Egyptian state endured precisely because it could absorb these tensions without collapsing entirely. Another point often overlooked is the role of priesthoods and elite officials in shaping royal reputation. Temples controlled significant economic resources. High-ranking priests held social authority. When a pharaoh disrupted established religious practice, as Akhenaten famously did, the reaction was not only theological but financial. Restoring traditional worship under his successors helped restabilize these networks. In such contexts, portraying a reforming king as misguided or morally flawed could serve institutional interests. Even in the case of sibling marriage among royal lines, genetic and historical evidence suggests complexity rather than simple moral decline. While repeated close-kin unions may have had health consequences, they also reinforced the idea that the royal family stood apart from ordinary society. The separation was intentional. Divine kingship required visible distinction. Over time, what was meant to elevate the monarchy could contribute to vulnerability, but that vulnerability was structural, not necessarily moral. As historians, we are cautious about projecting contemporary categories onto ancient systems. The word perverted implies deviation from a fixed norm, yet norms themselves vary across cultures and eras. What matters is understanding the internal logic of a society before evaluating it externally. Ancient Egypt operated within a worldview where kingship was sacred, fertility symbolic, and family political. Actions that appear startling today often aligned with that worldview's internal coherence. It is also telling that Egyptian literature itself contains wisdom texts advising moderation, restraint, and respect. These teachings suggest that self-control was valued. If royal behavior had consistently violated those ideals in obvious ways, we would likely see stronger direct criticism in contemporary sources. Instead, most surviving moral tales use generalized figures rather than naming specific reigning kings. That distance hints at caution, perhaps even reverence. Over time, layers of interpretation accumulated. Greek historians added their perspectives. Roman authors amplified contrasts. Medieval travelers contributed new impressions. Modern popular culture added dramatic framing. Each generation reshaped the image of Egypt's rulers to suit its own narrative needs. The result is a composite portrait where documented practice and imaginative embellishment coexist. When we strip away those layers carefully, what remains is neither scandal nor sanctity, but complexity. The pharaohs were political actors embedded in religious symbolism. They managed dynasties, negotiated alliances, sponsored monumental art, and navigated crises. Their personal lives mattered, but primarily because they intersected with state stability. So perhaps the most balanced conclusion is this: the phrase "most perverted pharaohs" survives because it captures attention. But attention is only the beginning of historical inquiry, not its end. When we look patiently at the evidence, we see a civilization that treated kingship as sacred responsibility. Controversies existed, certainly, yet they unfolded within a structured framework that prioritized order above spectacle. And that quiet distinction is what makes ancient Egypt so enduringly fascinating. Beneath the dramatic headlines lies a story of institutions, beliefs, and human choices woven together over millennia. It is a reminder that history rewards those willing to move beyond surface impressions and listen carefully to what the surviving record truly says. There is one more dimension that deepens this discussion, and that is the way power and vulnerability coexisted within the same royal body. To rule Egypt was to stand at the symbolic center of the universe as Egyptians understood it. The pharaoh was the guarantor of the Nile's flooding, the intermediary between humanity and the gods, the embodiment of order. Yet that same position created extraordinary exposure. Any perceived weakness, physical, moral, or political, could be magnified beyond proportion. In periods of strength, the king's image radiated stability. Monumental statues emphasized symmetry and composure. Inscriptions celebrated victories and divine favor. But in periods of strain, crop failure, military pressure, economic fluctuation, the search for explanation intensified. Ancient societies often interpreted hardship through moral frameworks. If balance faltered, perhaps the king had faltered. In such an environment, stories about excess or impropriety could spread not simply as gossip, but as attempts to explain instability. This pattern is not unique to Egypt. Across history, rulers facing crisis have been accused of indulgence, distraction, or moral failure. What makes Egypt distinctive is the theological dimension layered onto that accusation. Because the pharaoh's conduct symbolized cosmic balance, even minor rumors could acquire spiritual weight. The king's household, therefore, was never just a domestic sphere. It was an extension of the sacred state. At the same time, archaeological evidence continues to show how methodical Egyptian governance remained, even in so-called controversial reigns. Tax records were maintained. Grain was stored and redistributed. Temples functioned as economic centers. Craft workshops produced goods with remarkable consistency. These mundane details matter. They demonstrate that beneath any dramatic narrative, institutional continuity persisted. Modern viewers sometimes imagine ancient courts as spaces of constant luxury, removed from responsibility. Yet inscriptions repeatedly emphasize the king's role in hearing petitions, appointing officials, leading construction projects, and overseeing ritual. Even when certain rulers adopted unconventional artistic styles or theological reforms, administrative machinery did not simply dissolve. It adapted, resisted, or recalibrated. We must also acknowledge the limitations of our evidence. Egypt's climate preserved remarkable artifacts, but survival is still selective. What we possess represents a fraction of what once existed. Some accusations may reflect real tensions now lost to time. Others may be distortions that survived precisely because they were vivid. Historians weigh probability rather than certainty. In recent decades, interdisciplinary study has strengthened our understanding. DNA analysis has clarified royal lineages. Medical imaging has revealed health conditions without sensational speculation. Epigraphic surveys have refined translations of contested texts. Each advancement tends to replace dramatic assumption with layered nuance. The more closely we look, the more the caricature dissolves. And yet, the fascination endures. There is something inherently compelling about the intersection of divinity and humanity. A ruler proclaimed as godlike inevitably invites scrutiny of their human traits. That tension between idealized image and mortal reality fuels both ancient rumor and modern curiosity. It is a reminder that power magnifies perception. If we return to the central theme one final time, the so-called most perverted pharaohs were rarely defined by unrestrained behavior in any demonstrable sense. They were defined by narrative. Some disrupted tradition. Some presided over turbulent transitions. Some became symbols in foreign propaganda. Over centuries, those fragments accumulated into reputations that feel sharper than the underlying evidence supports. What remains, when the layers are carefully separated, is a portrait of rulers navigating extraordinary expectations. They married strategically, worshipped ceremonially, and ruled within a framework that fused family with statecraft. Their controversies reveal more about the fragility of legitimacy than about private indulgence. In the quiet study of history, that realization carries weight. It encourages patience. It reminds us that behind every dramatic headline stands a complex web of belief, structure, and survival. Ancient Egypt, with all its monuments and mysteries, rewards that patience. Its kings and queens were neither mythic caricatures nor moral lessons alone. They were participants in a civilization that sought order in a changing world. And so we leave the Nile once more, steady, measured, and enduring, much like the historical record itself. Beneath the surface stories flows a deeper current of continuity, one that invites us not to judge hastily, but to understand carefully. As a final reflection, it's helpful to consider how modern media shapes our expectations before we ever encounter the evidence. Dramatic phrasing, especially when attached to ancient royalty, creates an emotional frame. Words like most perverted suggest extremes, secret chambers, forbidden rituals, and moral collapse. But history rarely operates in extremes. It operates in patterns, pressures, incentives, and consequences. Ancient Egypt's royal system was designed for endurance. That endurance required adaptability. When dynasties changed, when religious emphasis shifted, when foreign influence increased, the institution of kingship adjusted. Some adjustments were subtle, others were dramatic. In moments of rapid change, later generations often searched for moral explanations. It is psychologically satisfying to believe that decline results from personal failure rather than structural complexity. Yet structural complexity is precisely what we find when we examine the so-called controversial pharaohs closely. Akhenaten's reforms, for example, did not emerge from personal whim alone. They intersected with existing theological currents, artistic experimentation, and the concentration of royal authority. The backlash after his death reflects institutional resistance, not simply rejection of an eccentric personality. Framing his reign as moral deviance simplifies a far more intricate process. Similarly, sibling marriage among royal lines was not spontaneous indulgence. It was embedded within a theology that placed the royal family in a divine category apart from ordinary society. The practice reinforced continuity and concentrated power. Whether modern observers approve is beside the historical point. Within its context, it functioned coherently. Even palace conspiracies, often retold with dramatic emphasis, illustrate calculated political maneuvering. Competing claims to succession are common in monarchies across cultures. Egypt was no exception. The survival of trial records related to the conspiracy against Ramesses III shows legal procedure and formal judgment. That bureaucratic response complicates any simplistic narrative of unchecked decadence. Foreign portrayals further shaped perception. Greek and Roman authors had incentives to contrast their own societies with the kingdoms they encountered. Egypt's antiquity and ritual richness made it an ideal canvas for exaggeration. Stories emphasizing sensuality or excess reinforced a broader cultural narrative about Eastern monarchies. Over time, those portrayals influenced how later generations in Europe and beyond imagined pharaonic life. Modern scholarship has worked steadily to rebalance that image. Archaeological data, careful translation, and comparative analysis reveal continuity where earlier narratives saw collapse. They highlight governance where popular accounts see indulgence. They show that Egypt's longevity depended less on personal excess and more on administrative resilience. There is also a philosophical dimension to this discussion. When we judge the past through contemporary moral vocabulary, we risk misunderstanding it. That does not mean suspending all ethical reflection. It means recognizing that categories evolve. What one society considers sacred, another may consider taboo. Understanding does not require approval. It requires context. The enduring allure of ancient Egypt lies partly in this tension between familiarity and difference. Its rulers were human, concerned with family, legacy, mortality. Yet they operated within a cosmology that elevated their role beyond ordinary limits. That duality invites both empathy and distance. It explains why stories about their personal lives continue to circulate, reshaped for each era's curiosity. In closing, the phrase that drew us here, "the most perverted pharaohs in history," ultimately serves as an entry point rather than a conclusion. It opens a door to examining how reputation forms, how power interacts with morality, and how memory evolves. Once inside, the landscape is broader and quieter than sensational language suggests. Ancient Egypt's rulers were architects of temples, patrons of art, commanders of armies, and participants in intricate religious ritual. Their controversies were real in the sense that they mattered to their contemporaries. But those controversies unfolded within structured systems designed to preserve order. If there is a lasting lesson, it is this: history becomes clearer when we move beyond the headline and into the framework beneath it. In that framework, Egypt's pharaohs appear not as caricatures of excess, but as complex leaders navigating extraordinary expectations. Thank you for spending this extended journey exploring the deeper layers behind the myths. If you value thoughtful, steady historical storytelling, subscribing helps this channel continue producing long-form documentaries grounded in clarity rather than spectacle. Until our next exploration, we leave the sands of Egypt with a reminder that the past rewards patience, and that even the most dramatic titles often conceal far more measured truths beneath them. Even after everything we've explored, there remains one quiet but essential question. Why do stories of royal excess endure more vividly than stories of administrative competence? The answer lies partly in how human memory works. Drama anchors itself more firmly than routine. A rumor about a king's private life travels farther than a record of grain distribution, even though the latter sustained millions of lives. Ancient Egypt understood the power of narrative better than most civilizations. Its temples were covered in carefully composed scenes presenting the king as eternally victorious, eternally pious, eternally composed. These were not casual decorations. They were acts of image control carved in stone. When such a system exists, anything that contradicts the official image becomes particularly compelling. A whisper gains force precisely because it challenges monumentality. That dynamic helps explain why certain pharaohs remain associated with controversy. Akhenaten's artistic revolution stood in visible contrast to centuries of stylistic consistency. The Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage unsettled Greek sensibilities. Cleopatra's diplomatic alliances threatened Rome's political ambitions. In each case, the ruler's actions intersected with a moment of tension. Later storytellers amplified those tensions into moral commentary. Yet when we widen the lens, the stability of Egyptian civilization is striking. Despite invasions, dynastic turnover, environmental fluctuations, and internal disputes, the core institutions endured. Religious rituals adapted but did not vanish. Agricultural cycles continued to structure daily life. Scribal education transmitted administrative knowledge across generations. These are not signs of a society collapsing under indulgence. They are signs of resilience. It is also worth noting that Egyptian moral thought, preserved in wisdom literature, consistently emphasized moderation, self-control, and respect for social boundaries. Texts advised young officials to guard their speech, to act justly, to avoid arrogance. Such teachings suggest that ethical reflection was integral to elite culture. If royal life had been defined by unchecked excess, we might expect sharper internal criticism preserved in contemporary sources. Instead, much of what survives as scandal comes from later retellings shaped by political agendas. Modern fascination with labeling certain pharaohs as perverted may reveal more about our appetite for dramatic framing than about ancient behavior. Sensational language promises revelation, but revelation in historical study usually arrives through patient accumulation of evidence. It comes from comparing inscriptions, cross-referencing dates, analyzing burial goods, and reconstructing social context. In the end, Egypt's most controversial rulers share something fundamental with its most celebrated ones. They operated within a worldview that fused personal life and public symbolism. Their marriages were political instruments. Their heirs represented continuity. Their religious rituals reinforced legitimacy. Even their artistic representations were strategic. When we remove the sensational overlay, what remains is complexity rather than spectacle. We see leaders navigating fragile balances between innovation and tradition, between divine image and human limitation, between internal loyalty and external pressure. Some succeeded more gracefully than others. Some left legacies later generations reshaped. But none can be reduced entirely to a single provocative label. And perhaps that is the quiet power of long-form history. It resists reduction. It allows space for contradiction. It acknowledges uncertainty. Ancient Egypt, with its vast chronological span and rich material record, rewards that slower approach. The further we move from headline to evidence, the more coherent the civilization appears. So as we finally close this extended examination, we do so with a measured perspective. The so-called most perverted pharaohs were, in reality, rulers situated within a sacred monarchy that magnified every aspect of their lives. Their reputations evolved through political rivalry, cultural translation, and modern retelling. Beneath those layers lies a civilization defined less by scandal than by structure. Thank you for staying with this calm, detailed journey into Egypt's royal world. If thoughtful analysis is what you value, subscribing supports more documentaries that prioritize depth over drama. Until next time, we leave the monuments standing in their desert silence. Reminders that history, when approached patiently, often tells a story far more nuanced than the title suggests. As we linger just a little longer with this subject, it becomes clear that the deeper lesson is not about identifying which pharaoh was most extreme, but about understanding how power invites interpretation. Ancient Egypt placed extraordinary symbolic weight on the body of the king. He was depicted larger than other figures in reliefs, aligned with gods in temple scenes, and named in cartouches meant to endure for eternity. When one individual carries that much symbolic meaning, every human trait, strength, illness, affection, ambition, acquires amplified significance. That amplification explains why even limited evidence can generate expansive narratives. A damaged inscription becomes a clue. An unusual statue becomes a theory. A later literary fragment becomes a character study. Over centuries, interpretation layers upon interpretation. By the time those layers reach modern audiences, they can resemble certainty, even when the foundation is partial. It is also important to consider how differently ancient societies conceptualized privacy. Modern culture draws a sharp line between public office and private life. In pharaonic Egypt, that boundary was porous. The king's marriage was a diplomatic statement. The birth of an heir was a national event. Religious festivals presented the royal family before the gods and the populace. The personal and the political were inseparable. In that context, discussing a ruler's intimate life was not automatically sensational. It was sometimes simply political reporting. However, later retellings often removed that context. Greek and Roman authors, writing for audiences fascinated by exotic courts, emphasized elements that felt foreign or morally charged. Centuries later, European scholarship, sometimes shaped by its own social taboos, repeated and intensified those impressions. Popular media in the modern era, seeking dramatic hooks, further distilled complexity into striking headlines. Against that backdrop, careful historical study acts as a stabilizing force. Archaeology grounds speculation in material culture. Textual analysis restores linguistic nuance. Comparative study situates Egypt within a broader pattern of ancient monarchies. When examined alongside Mesopotamia, Persia, or Hellenistic kingdoms, Egyptian practices appear less anomalous and more reflective of widespread strategies of dynastic preservation. Even the practice of royal sibling marriage, often highlighted as uniquely shocking, finds parallels in other ancient cultures where divine kingship or concentrated inheritance required clear lines of legitimacy. What distinguishes Egypt is not that such practices existed, but that they were embedded within an exceptionally long-lived theological system. And that longevity deserves emphasis. Few civilizations sustained a recognizable political and religious identity for as many centuries as Egypt did. Such endurance required adaptability, discipline, and institutional memory. Scandals alone do not produce millennia of continuity. Structure does. So when we encounter claims about the most perverted pharaohs, we can approach them with informed curiosity rather than reflexive judgment. We can ask, what source makes this claim? In what context was it written? What political or cultural purpose might it have served? And what does the broader archaeological record suggest? Those questions do not eliminate intrigue. They refine it. They shift the focus from sensational detail to historical process. They remind us that the study of the past is less about confirming dramatic assumptions and more about reconstructing lived realities. In the quiet spaces between monuments and manuscripts, a more balanced portrait of Egypt's rulers emerges. They were guardians of temples, negotiators of alliances, patrons of artisans, and heads of expansive households. Their lives intersected with ritual symbolism and practical governance in equal measure. Some were reformers, some were traditionalists, some presided over prosperity, others faced decline. All operated within a system that magnified their choices. And perhaps that is where we finally rest. Not with a list of extremes, but with an appreciation for complexity. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were neither saints nor caricatures. They were human beings elevated to divine office, remembered through layers of admiration, rivalry, and reinterpretation. If you found value in taking the slower path through this subject, examining context before conclusion, consider subscribing for more long-form explorations grounded in evidence and clarity. History, like the Nile, reveals its true depth when approached patiently. As a final, steady thought to leave you with, consider how much of what we believe about ancient rulers is shaped not by what they did, but by who wrote about them afterward. In Egypt, literacy was concentrated among scribes and priests. Monumental inscriptions were commissioned by the state. Later narratives were copied, adapted, and sometimes reinterpreted generations after the events they describe. That means reputation was never static. It was curated, challenged, revised, and occasionally weaponized. When a dynasty wished to legitimize itself, it emphasized continuity with admired predecessors. When it wished to distance itself from uncomfortable chapters, it could allow silence or subtle criticism to do the work. Over time, even small narrative adjustments accumulate. A king remembered as unconventional may gradually become remembered as improper. A political rival may transform into a cautionary tale. The distance between nuance and exaggeration narrows as context fades. This process helps explain why certain pharaohs appear larger than life in moral discussions. They stood at moments of transition. Akhenaten challenged religious orthodoxy. Ramesses III faced internal conspiracy. The Ptolemies governed a culturally layered kingdom. Cleopatra confronted the rising power of Rome. Each case involved instability, and instability invites storytelling. Stories simplify instability by assigning personal cause. But simplification should not replace investigation. The evidence from Egypt repeatedly shows administrative continuity, religious adaptation, and economic resilience even during turbulent reigns. These realities complicate any image of unchecked decadence. They suggest that whatever personal controversies existed, they unfolded within a functioning state apparatus. There is also something telling about the way Egyptian art portrays aging rulers. Unlike some later traditions that hide frailty, certain statues and reliefs present kings with realistic features: lined faces, heavy eyelids, thoughtful expressions. These images do not suggest lives consumed solely by indulgence. They suggest individuals carrying responsibility across decades. Modern audiences, surrounded by rapid information and dramatic headlines, sometimes inherit older sensational interpretations without realizing their origins. Yet history benefits from slowness. It benefits from stepping back and asking whether a vivid label captures complexity or conceals it. In the case of Egypt's so-called most perverted pharaohs, the label often conceals more than it reveals. What we find instead is a civilization deeply invested in order, cosmic, social, and political. Its rulers were expected to embody that order. When they deviated, intentionally or not, reaction followed. That reaction might take the form of reform, erasure, rumor, or reinterpretation. Across centuries, those reactions shaped memory as much as original actions did. And so, as we close this extended examination for the last time, the desert landscape feels quieter than the headline promised. The temples stand. The tombs remain. The inscriptions still speak of offerings, victories, and devotion. Within that enduring record, controversies are threads, important, revealing, but not defining the whole tapestry. Ancient Egypt's pharaohs were complex figures inhabiting a sacred office. Their personal lives intersected with statecraft in ways that modern categories only partially capture. To understand them fully requires patience, context, and a willingness to move beyond spectacle. Thank you for joining this calm, in-depth exploration. If thoughtful, measured history is what you appreciate, subscribing helps continue these long-form journeys into the past. Until next time, we leave the Nile at dusk, steady, reflective, and carrying with it the layered memories of a civilization that still invites us to look closer rather than louder. If we allow ourselves one last slow reflection, it may be this: civilizations are rarely defined by their scandals, but by what they build despite them. Ancient Egypt built in stone. It built in ritual. It built in memory. And memory, more than anything else, is where the reputations of its pharaohs continue to live. The desert preserves monuments with an almost indifferent calm. Colossal statues gaze forward, untouched by the rumors that once may have circulated in palace corridors. Temple walls remain covered with scenes of offering and devotion. The archaeological record, for all its gaps, tends to emphasize continuity over chaos. It is quiet evidence, steady, repetitive, institutional. That contrast between monument and rumor is revealing. Monumental art presents the ideal. Rumor reveals anxiety. When later generations described certain rulers as excessive or morally deviant, they were often expressing unease about change. Change unsettles order. In a civilization built around the concept of balance, harmony, rightness, anything that felt disruptive could be framed as imbalance in the ruler himself. This framing is psychologically powerful, personalizes structural tension. Instead of grappling with economic strain, religious reform, or geopolitical pressure, societies sometimes tell stories about flawed leaders. The story is easier to hold. It gives uncertainty a face. Yet Egypt's endurance suggests that whatever personal controversies existed, they did not dismantle the core system. Even after religious upheaval, temples reopened. Even after dynastic shifts, scribes recorded regnal years. Even after foreign conquest, Egyptian iconography persisted. These are not signs of a civilization undone by excess. They are signs of adaptive strength. It is also worth remembering that most Egyptians were not members of the royal household. Their daily concerns centered on farming cycles, craft production, local worship, and family life. Royal scandal, whether real or exaggerated, would have filtered through these communities in limited ways. The grand narrative of decadence often belongs more to elite discourse than to ordinary lived experience. When we study the pharaohs through a calm lens, we begin to see them as focal points in a vast network of belief and bureaucracy. Their marriages linked regions. Their heirs symbolized continuity. Their temple dedications redistributed wealth. Their policies influenced trade and defense. Personal choices mattered, but they mattered because of institutional consequence, not because of spectacle alone. Modern storytelling, especially in competitive media spaces, gravitates toward intensity. Titles must capture attention. Extremes attract curiosity. But long-form history offers something different: proportion. It allows space for contradiction. It acknowledges where evidence is strong and where it remains uncertain. It resists the urge to inflate. In the case of Egypt's most controversial pharaohs, proportion reveals a consistent pattern. Accusations of perversion or excess tend to cluster around moments of instability, cultural collision, or ideological change. They serve narrative functions, explaining disruption, justifying reform, reinforcing identity. When stripped of that narrative framing, what remains is governance within a sacred monarchy. And perhaps that is the most enduring insight. Ancient Egypt fused divinity and politics so completely that the king's humanity could never disappear, but neither could his symbolic role. Every strength was magnified. Every weakness, whether real or rumored, echoed more loudly than it might have in another society. As we finally bring this exploration to rest, we leave not with a catalog of sensational claims, but with a clearer understanding of how power shapes memory. The pharaohs were not defined solely by scandal, nor were they immune to human complexity. They were leaders navigating a system that demanded both sacred image and practical authority. Thank you for spending this extended time in thoughtful reflection. If you value history approached with patience rather than spectacle, subscribing supports more documentaries that aim for clarity over exaggeration. Until our next journey into the past, we let the monuments stand in their desert stillness, reminders that beneath every dramatic headline lies a deeper, steadier story waiting to be understood. As we take one final step back from the noise of dramatic labels, it's worth recognizing something quietly profound. Ancient Egypt never described its rulers in the language we use today. The surviving inscriptions speak of strength, devotion, divine favor, restoration, victory, and offering. Even when a king failed, the official tone leaned toward correction or renewal, not scandal. That difference in vocabulary matters. Language shapes perception. When modern audiences encounter phrases like "most perverted pharaohs," we are stepping into a framework that did not exist in pharaonic thought. The Egyptians framed morality through balance and duty. A ruler who disrupted balance was dangerous not because he was shocking, but because he threatened cosmic order. That is a very different emphasis. This distinction becomes clearer when we examine how Egyptian society handled wrongdoing more broadly. Legal texts show structured trials, recorded testimonies, and formal judgments. Even in the famous conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III, the surviving papyri describe procedures and verdicts with bureaucratic clarity. There is little theatrical condemnation. The system responded to perceived threats with administration, not spectacle. And yet, spectacle grows over time. When later cultures retell these events, details become sharper, motives become more dramatic, personalities more exaggerated. The gradual layering of interpretation transforms political conflict into moral legend. In that transformation, rulers who were once complex actors become simplified symbols. We also have to remember that Egypt's chronology spans thousands of years. It is easy to speak of the pharaohs as if they were a uniform group. In reality, their contexts varied enormously. The Old Kingdom differed from the New Kingdom. The late period differed from the Ptolemaic era. Practices acceptable in one period could be controversial in another. Without careful attention to time and place, sweeping labels blur crucial distinctions. Even the architectural record resists caricature. Palaces and temple complexes show careful planning rather than chaotic indulgence. Administrative centers reveal organized storage and distribution systems. Artisans' villages, like Deir el-Medina, preserve evidence of structured labor and state support. These details remind us that Egypt functioned through coordination, not excess alone. Modern fascination with royal intimacy often says as much about contemporary culture as it does about the ancient world. We live in an era that closely monitors the private lives of public figures. That lens can distort our reading of the past. When we apply it retroactively, we risk misunderstanding societies that did not separate public and private in the same way. In ancient Egypt, the king's household was part of the state apparatus. Marriage created alliances. Birth secured succession. Ritual intimacy symbolized cosmic union. To isolate those acts from their political and religious setting is to misread them. They were not hidden deviations from the system, they were components of it. Of course, none of this suggests that every pharaoh ruled wisely or that every decision strengthened the state. Some policies failed. Some reforms generated resistance. Some reigns ended in conflict. But complexity is not the same as depravity. Structural tension is not the same as moral collapse. As we close this long reflection for good, what remains is a deeper appreciation for proportion. Egypt's rulers were products of a sacred monarchy that elevated them above ordinary society while binding them tightly to its survival. Their reputations shifted across centuries because memory itself is political. When we study them carefully, beyond dramatic phrasing, we find leaders shaped by theology, constrained by tradition, and challenged by circumstance. We find a civilization remarkably consistent in its pursuit of order. And we find that the most enduring stories are often quieter than the headlines suggest. Thank you for taking this measured journey through one of history's most misunderstood themes. If you value historical depth presented with calm clarity, subscribing supports more documentaries that prioritize evidence over exaggeration. Until our next exploration, we leave the sands of Egypt in their timeless stillness, reminding us that history speaks most clearly when we listen without rushing to judgment. If we allow ourselves one final meditation on this subject, it may be less about the rulers themselves and more about the way time reshapes reputation. Ancient Egypt lasted for over 3 millennia. Across that immense stretch of history, countless kings and queens rose, ruled, and were buried. Most are remembered today not for scandal, but for monuments, reforms, or military campaigns. The few whose names are attached to controversy stand out precisely because they are exceptions in a system built on repetition and order. Repetition was a strength. Rituals followed prescribed patterns. Royal titulary remained consistent. Artistic proportions adhered to long-established canons. This cultural continuity created stability, but it also meant that deviation was highly visible. When a pharaoh introduced something new, whether in theology, art, or family arrangement, the contrast with tradition amplified the change. Amplification, in turn, made reinterpretation easier for later generations. The Egyptian concept of kingship depended heavily on symbolism. The double crown united Upper and Lower Egypt. The crook and flail signified authority and provision. Even posture in sculpture conveyed meaning. Within such a symbolic system, the king's personal conduct could not easily be separated from his political role. A rumor about intimacy was never only about intimacy. It was about legitimacy, strength, and divine favor. Yet, despite the occasional storm of interpretation, the broader arc of Egyptian civilization demonstrates remarkable resilience. Temples were repaired after periods of neglect. Dynasties reasserted traditional worship after episodes of reform. Administrative districts maintained agricultural productivity even during succession disputes. The machinery of state endured because it was larger than any one personality. Modern audiences often search for extremes in order to make sense of distant history. It is tempting to reduce complexity to clear categories: heroic, tyrannical, decadent. But ancient Egypt resists such simplification. Its rulers occupied an office that demanded both human adaptability and divine projection. They navigated internal rivalries, external threats, economic management, and spiritual expectations simultaneously. When later writers, Greek, Roman, medieval, or modern, highlighted sensational aspects of Egyptian royalty, they did so through their own cultural lenses. Each era layered its concerns onto the past. Over time, those layers can obscure as much as they reveal. Stripping them back requires patience and disciplined attention to primary evidence. And that is perhaps the quiet achievement of studying history in depth. The more closely we examine the record, the less dramatic it becomes, and the more fascinating. We see not caricatures of excess, but administrators balancing temple endowments. Not shadowy figures of indulgence, but rulers negotiating alliances and succession. Not a civilization undone by private vice, but one sustained by institutional memory. In the end, the phrase that began this journey, "the most perverted pharaohs in history," serves as a reminder of how powerful framing can be. It draws us in with intensity, but once inside, the landscape is broader and steadier. The real story lies in how monarchy, religion, and family intertwined in a civilization that valued order above all else. As we truly conclude this extended exploration, the image that lingers is not scandal, but continuity. The Nile's annual flood, the alignment of temples to the sun, the careful carving of hieroglyphs. These rhythms defined Egypt far more than any whispered accusation. Thank you for staying through this long, measured documentary reflection. If you appreciate thoughtful history told without spectacle, subscribing supports more deep explorations like this one. Until our next journey into the ancient world, we leave Egypt as it has always stood in memory, monumental, complex, and far more nuanced than any single dramatic title could ever contain. Before we finally let this subject rest, there is value in sitting quietly with one more perspective: the relationship between myth, morality, and memory. Ancient Egypt did not separate these categories the way we often do today. Myth informed morality. Morality informed kingship, and kingship shaped collective memory. When later generations judged earlier rulers, they did so within this intertwined framework. In Egyptian cosmology, the ultimate measure of a ruler was not personal restraint in a modern sense, but alignment with Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and right order. A pharaoh who upheld Ma'at ensured agricultural stability, divine favor, and social harmony. A pharaoh who disrupted it invited disorder. Over time, if disorder followed a reign, retrospective explanations often focused on the king's character. The human mind prefers causation with a face. This is why accusations related to excess, whether sexual, religious, or political, became such effective narrative tools. They personalized instability. They suggested that cosmic imbalance had a tangible source. But personalization simplifies complexity. Economic fluctuation, climate irregularity, military pressure, and bureaucratic strain are harder to condense into story than the idea of a flawed ruler. The Amarna period again provides a powerful illustration. Akhenaten's religious transformation shifted resources and influence away from established priesthoods. That shift had consequences. After his death, restoration required both theological and political repair. In the process of restoration, reinterpretation followed. What had been innovation could be reframed as aberration. What had been reform could be described as excess. In such moments, moral language becomes shorthand for structural correction. Similarly, the later Ptolemaic rulers governed a kingdom already layered with Greek and Egyptian traditions. Their marriages, rituals, and diplomatic strategies operated within dual cultural expectations. To Egyptian audiences, sibling marriage reinforced divine kingship. To many Greek observers, it violated social norms. The same act carried different meanings depending on perspective. When Roman authors later wrote about these rulers, they filtered them through Roman political anxieties, intensifying the portrayal of decadence to strengthen Rome's own identity. We must also consider how selective survival shapes our conclusions. Monumental inscriptions endure. Informal commentary often does not. The fragments that remain may exaggerate what was once marginal. A satirical tale copied centuries later can loom larger in modern imagination than administrative records that were never intended to entertain. This imbalance can distort proportion. Modern archaeological practice helps restore that proportion. Excavations reveal ordinary continuity beneath royal controversy. Storage facilities show grain management. Workers' villages display organized labor structures. Trade goods demonstrate ongoing exchange networks. These material realities anchor interpretation. They remind us that governance continued even when reputation fluctuated. There is something almost paradoxical here. The very civilization whose rulers are sometimes labeled with dramatic moral terms is also one of the most institutionally consistent in ancient history. Its calendar remained stable. Its religious iconography endured. Its language evolved gradually rather than abruptly. That steadiness is incompatible with the idea of sustained moral collapse at the top. And so we return to the central idea one last time. Sensational framing draws attention, but careful context reveals depth. Egypt's pharaohs lived in a world where personal life and political symbolism were inseparable. Their marriages reinforced succession. Their heirs embodied continuity. Their religious participation sustained cosmic order. When controversies arose, they mattered because the office itself magnified every action. The enduring fascination with labeling certain pharaohs as extreme reflects our ongoing desire to humanize power. We want to see flaws in those elevated above us. But history becomes richer when we move beyond the search for extremes and toward understanding systems. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built on continuity of belief, of administration, of cultural identity. Its rulers were participants in that continuity. Some altered it, some challenged it, some restored it. None existed outside it. As we close this final reflection, the image that remains is not scandal, but structure. The temples aligned with the sun, the Nile rising and receding, the steady carving of hieroglyphs into stone. Within that rhythm, the lives of pharaohs unfolded, complex, symbolic, human. Thank you for spending this extended journey exploring history at a measured pace. If you value documentaries that favor context over spectacle, subscribing supports more thoughtful explorations like this one. Until our next deep dive into the ancient world, we leave Egypt's rulers where they belong, not reduced to headlines, but situated within the enduring framework of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. If we take one final, measured breath with this subject, we arrive at something quieter than scandal and more enduring than rumor: perspective. Ancient Egypt invites perspective because it stretches across such vast spans of time. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals shifted, artistic styles evolved. Yet the core idea of sacred kingship persisted. That persistence should shape how we interpret any claims about excess or moral deviation among its rulers. When modern audiences encounter dramatic descriptions of certain pharaohs, the instinct is to isolate those figures from the larger current of history. But Egypt does not function well in isolation. Every reign was embedded within inherited structures, priesthoods, scribal schools, taxation systems, agricultural cycles, trade routes, and military logistics. A king could influence these systems, but he did not invent them from nothing, nor could personal inclination alone dismantle them overnight. This broader lens helps us understand why even controversial reigns rarely resulted in total collapse. After Akhenaten's theological experiment, traditional worship returned. After palace conspiracies, succession continued. After foreign conquest, Egyptian religious imagery endured. These patterns suggest institutional resilience that outlived individual personalities. There is also something important about scale. The monuments most tourists see today, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, Giza, were not constructed in eras defined by chaos. They required organized labor, surplus resources, and coordinated administration. The civilization capable of producing them was disciplined at its core. While palace intrigue may have existed, it unfolded within a framework of remarkable stability. That stability does not eliminate human complexity. Pharaohs were not abstractions. They experienced illness, grief, ambition, loyalty, rivalry. Some married for alliance. Some ruled for decades. Some inherited fragile situations. Yet human experience within a royal context does not automatically translate into moral spectacle. It translates into pressure. Pressure to maintain divine image, to produce heirs, to secure borders, to fund temples, to satisfy elite factions. In moments of tension, storytelling fills gaps. Later generations look backward and search for meaning. If a dynasty ended abruptly, perhaps the last ruler was flawed. If religious practice shifted dramatically, perhaps the innovator was misguided. These interpretations serve emotional and political purposes. They provide closure, but they can also oversimplify. The endurance of the perverted pharaoh narrative illustrates how easily moral framing can overshadow structural analysis. It is far easier to remember a dramatic label than a detailed explanation of inheritance law or temple economy. But serious historical inquiry invites us to prefer explanation over label. Modern scholarship continues to refine our understanding. Advances in archaeology and philology allow us to reconstruct context with greater precision. We can trace family trees more accurately. We can identify building phases in temples. We can analyze trade goods to map economic networks. These developments gradually replace sensationalism with nuance. And nuance, in the case of Egypt, is deeply rewarding. It reveals a civilization that balanced continuity with adaptation. It reveals rulers who navigated expectations far more complex than caricature suggests. It reveals that accusations of excess often reflect moments of cultural collision, especially when foreign observers encountered practices unfamiliar to them. Ultimately, what lingers after this long reflection is not a list of extremes, but an appreciation for proportion. Ancient Egypt's rulers were guardians of a sacred institution that fused politics and theology. Their lives mattered because the office magnified them. But magnification is not the same as distortion. It simply means that actions carried weight. As we truly close this extended documentary journey, we return to the desert horizon. Calm, expansive, patient. The monuments remain, not because their builders were defined by scandal, but because they were sustained by structure. The Nile continues its steady rhythm, as it did through every reign discussed here. Thank you for investing your time in a deeper, quieter exploration of this topic. If you value history approached with care and balance rather than spectacle, subscribing supports more long-form documentaries built on evidence and clarity. Until our next exploration into the ancient world, we leave Egypt not as a realm of exaggerated excess, but as a civilization of enduring complexity and remarkable continuity. As we reach what is truly the final reflection in this long exploration, it may help to shift from asking which pharaoh was most extreme to asking why we are drawn to that question at all. Across cultures and centuries, powerful figures attract stories that magnify their humanity in dramatic ways. When rulers are elevated to near-divine status, audiences instinctively search for evidence of weakness. It restores balance in our imagination. In the case of ancient Egypt, where kings were described as living gods, that instinct becomes even stronger. But Egypt's own worldview did not center on exposing weakness. It centered on sustaining harmony. The king's role was to mediate between gods and people, to secure the flood of the Nile, to maintain justice in the courts, to sponsor temple rituals, and to defend borders. These were not abstract duties. They were ongoing responsibilities woven into daily life. When we examine surviving records, we see repeated emphasis on offering scenes, building projects, diplomatic exchanges, and military organization. These are the rhythms that defined most reigns. The dramatic episodes, religious reform under Akhenaten, the palace conspiracy during Ramesses III's reign, the sibling marriages of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra's entanglement with Rome, stand out because they intersected with moments of uncertainty. Uncertainty invites interpretation, and interpretation often takes moral form. Yet even in those moments, continuity persisted. After Amarna, traditional cults were restored. After conspiracies, administrative systems continued to function. After foreign conquest, Egyptian religious imagery endured within new political frameworks. These recoveries are not footnotes. They are central to understanding the civilization's resilience. There is also a cautionary lesson here about translation across time. What later writers called excess may have been ritual symbolism. What seemed shocking to Greek or Roman observers may have carried sacred meaning in Egyptian thought. Cultural distance can transform ordinary practice into exotic spectacle. When those interpretations are repeated without context, they harden into stereotype. Modern historical study works patiently against that hardening. It asks what evidence supports a claim, compares sources, considers motive. It recognizes that silence in the record can be as meaningful as accusation. In many cases, the strongest evidence for institutional stability outweighs the weakest evidence for dramatic scandal. And so, the story resolves not into a catalog of depravity, but into a meditation on power and memory. Pharaohs were individuals, yes, with preferences, families, ambitions, and limitations. But they were also embodiments of an office that demanded divine symbolism and political competence. Their personal lives cannot be cleanly separated from their public roles, yet neither can they be reduced to spectacle. The monuments of Egypt endure because they were built within systems that functioned over centuries. Stone temples require organization, labor management, supply chains, architectural planning, and sustained resources. A civilization consumed by unchecked indulgence does not produce that level of continuity. What remains after the sensational language fades is something steadier. A portrait of leaders navigating immense responsibility in a sacred monarchy. Some introduced change. Some resisted it. Some ruled long and left abundant heirs. Others presided over fragile transitions. But each operated within a framework that valued order above chaos. If there is a lasting takeaway, it is this: history deepens when we move beyond headlines and into structure. Egypt's rulers were not caricatures defined by scandal. They were participants in one of the longest-lasting political and religious systems in human history. Thank you for staying through this extended, measured journey. If thoughtful, long-form history that prioritizes context over sensationalism is what you appreciate, subscribing helps support more documentaries like this. Until our next exploration, we leave ancient Egypt as it truly stands: monumental, complex, and far more nuanced than any dramatic title alone could ever capture. As we settle into what is genuinely the final stretch of this exploration, it's worth turning our attention to the enduring tension between spectacle and scholarship. Spectacle compresses centuries into moments. Scholarship stretches moments back into centuries. When it comes to ancient Egypt, that difference matters more than almost anywhere else because the civilization itself was built on duration, on continuity measured not in decades but in millennia. When modern narratives isolate certain pharaohs as uniquely extreme, they often detach those rulers from the slow-moving systems that shaped them. Yet, Egyptian kingship was not improvised with each succession. It was inherited. Ritual formulas were memorized and repeated. Architectural plans followed canonical proportions. Titles echoed through generations. Even innovation occurred within recognizable boundaries. That continuity does not eliminate controversy, but it frames it. Consider again how often moral language intensifies during periods of transition. The Amarna Revolution under Akhenaten disrupted entrenched priesthoods and reoriented religious devotion. The backlash that followed was as much institutional as theological. Later portrayals of the period absorbed that institutional discomfort into narratives about abnormality. The result is a reputation that feels more dramatic than the surviving evidence strictly requires. Or consider the Ptolemaic dynasty, ruling a culturally layered kingdom after the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. The blending of Greek and Egyptian customs created practices that appeared contradictory depending on perspective. To Egyptians, sibling marriage among rulers reinforced divine kingship. To Greeks and Romans, it appeared shocking. The same event carried radically different meanings. Memory, filtered through Roman political rivalry, magnified the shock. These examples remind us that scandal is rarely universal. It is culturally situated. What one society frames as sacred, another may frame as excess. Without context, we risk projecting our own assumptions backward onto unfamiliar worlds. There is also a structural reason why dramatic reputations endure. They are easier to transmit. A headline travels faster than a footnote. A story about a controversial ruler captures attention more quickly than a discussion of agricultural taxation systems or temple endowments. Yet those quieter systems sustained Egypt's longevity. They formed the backbone against which every ruler operated. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this perspective. Storage complexes reveal careful resource management. Administrative ostraca record labor assignments and supply deliveries. Temple inscriptions detail offerings and festival schedules with methodical precision. These documents speak not of chaos, but of organization. Even in reigns later described as unstable, the machinery of state often continued to function. This does not mean that every accusation was invented. Human behavior is complex, and power magnifies temptation as well as responsibility. But the leap from complexity to caricature is a large one. Responsible history resists that leap. The longer we sit with Egypt's record, the more its defining quality appears to be balance. Balance between innovation and tradition, between divine symbolism and administrative practicality, between personal authority and institutional continuity. That balance explains endurance far more convincingly than any narrative of sustained moral collapse. And perhaps that is the final calm insight this topic offers. The phrase "most perverted pharaohs" draws attention because it promises extremes. But ancient Egypt was, above all, a civilization of equilibrium. Its rulers, whatever their personal traits, were bound by systems designed to maintain order. As we close this extended documentary reflection at last, the enduring image is not of scandal, but of structure. Columns aligned with the sun, hieroglyphs carved with deliberate care, a river rising and receding with dependable rhythm. Within that vast continuity, individual reigns unfolded, sometimes turbulent, sometimes serene, always situated within something larger. Thank you for spending this time exploring Egypt through a lens of patience and proportion. If you appreciate historical storytelling that favors depth over drama, subscribing helps continue more long-form documentaries like this one. Until our next journey into the ancient world, we leave the pharaohs not as sensational figures frozen in rumor, but as complex leaders shaped by one of the most enduring civilizations humanity has ever known. As we truly bring this subject to its quiet conclusion, it may help to remember that history is not a courtroom. It does not exist to prosecute the past according to present standards. It exists to understand systems, motivations, and consequences within their own worlds. Ancient Egypt, perhaps more than any other civilization, demands that kind of patience. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian kingship maintained a recognizable identity. The regalia remained consistent. The religious symbolism endured. The expectation that the pharaoh embodied Mot did not disappear with each succession. That continuity alone should caution us against assuming that extreme personal excess defined the institution. An office cannot survive that long on instability alone. When we look carefully at the rulers often associated with controversy, we find patterns shaped by circumstance. Akhenaten's religious transformation unfolded during a moment of centralized royal power and theological experimentation. Ramesses III's conspiracy occurred in a complex court environment where succession stakes were high. The Ptolemaic sibling marriages reflected an effort to merge Macedonian dynasty with Egyptian divine tradition. Cleopatra's alliances were strategic decisions in the shadow of Roman expansion. Each case involves political calculus, not simple indulgence. The human tendency to condense complexity into moral narrative is understandable. Stories with clear villains and dramatic flaws are easier to retell. They travel across generations with little explanation required. But the cost of that simplicity is distortion. It can obscure the structures that truly shaped events. Egyptian society was deeply invested in continuity. Agricultural cycles, Temple festivals and administrative routines formed the rhythm of daily life. Even during periods remembered as unstable, these rhythms rarely vanished. That endurance suggests that whatever personal controversies surrounded certain pharaohs, they did not dismantle the core mechanisms of governance. There is also an irony worth noting. The same civilization, sometimes framed as decadent by later commentators, is one of the most architecturally disciplined in history. The precision of pyramid construction, the alignment of temples with celestial events, the meticulous carving of reliefs. These achievements required planning, restraint, and collective coordination. They do not reflect a culture consumed by disorder. In many ways, the fascination with labeling certain rulers as extreme says more about modern storytelling than about ancient practice. Contemporary audiences are accustomed to examining the private lives of public figures in detail. We project that curiosity backward. But the ancient Egyptian framework did not divide private and public life in the same way. The king's household was inseparable from the state. Marriage, fertility, ritual intimacy, these were political acts embedded within sacred symbolism. When we strip away later exaggeration, what remains is a civilization structured around balance. Its rulers were human, yes, capable of ambition, error, and complexity, but they operated within expectations that constrained and defined them. Their reputations shifted because memory is shaped by those who survive to tell the story. And so, as we finally set this topic down, the most responsible conclusion is one of proportion. Ancient Egypt's pharaohs were not caricatures of moral excess. They were participants in a sacred monarchy that magnified their actions and preserved their images. Some reigns sparked controversy. Some invited reinterpretation. But none can be fully understood through a single sensational label. Thank you for following this extended, deliberate journey through one of history's most misunderstood themes. If you value thoughtful, calm exploration over spectacle, subscribing supports more documentaries built on clarity and context. Until our next deep dive into the ancient world, we leave the Nile flowing steadily, a reminder that history, like the river itself, rewards those who take the time to observe its full course rather than only its surface ripples. If there is one last idea worth leaving in the quiet air, it is this: endurance is the ultimate measure of a civilization. Ancient Egypt endured, not for a generation, not for a century, but for thousands of years. That fact alone reframes how we should interpret the reputations of its rulers. Civilizations defined by sustained moral collapse do not construct architectural wonders that stand for millennia. They do not maintain coherent religious systems across dozens of dynasties. They do not preserve administrative literacy through repeated political transitions. Egypt did all of these things. That continuity suggests that whatever personal controversies surrounded certain pharaohs, they existed within boundaries that the broader system could absorb. When historians look across the arc of Egyptian history, they see cycles of consolidation, expansion, contraction, and renewal. They see experimentation followed by restoration. They see foreign influence woven into older traditions. What they do not see is a civilization repeatedly undone by private indulgence at the top. That does not mean Egypt was static. It evolved. Artistic styles shifted from the rigid formalism of the Old Kingdom to the fluid expressiveness of Amarna and back again. Religious emphasis moved from one cult center to another. Political power oscillated between strong centralized monarchies and more distributed authority. Through all of this, the concept of sacred kingship remained intact. The reason moral accusations linger is because they serve narrative clarity. It is easier to explain upheaval by pointing to a flawed individual than by untangling economic strain, climate variability, military overextension, or elite factionalism. But real history is rarely tidy. It is layered, interconnected, and often resistant to simple cause and effect. In the case of Egypt's so-called most controversial pharaohs, careful examination repeatedly returns us to context. Sibling marriage reflected dynastic strategy within divine kingship. Religious reform reflected shifts in theological and political concentration. Palace intrigue reflected high-stakes succession politics. Foreign alliances reflected geopolitical calculation. None of these phenomena are unique to Egypt, nor are they reducible to spectacle. Modern fascination with extreme labels often reflects our own era's appetite for dramatic framing. Yet long-form historical study offers something steadier. It allows us to see rulers as complex participants in enduring systems. It encourages us to separate later propaganda from contemporary evidence. It reminds us that memory evolves. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom to carry forward. The pharaohs were not timeless caricatures of excess. They were human leaders operating within a sacred office that magnified their actions and preserved their names. Some were innovators. Some were restorers. Some faced crisis. Some presided over stability. All were shaped by the expectations of a civilization deeply committed to order. As we finally close this extended reflection for good, the lasting image is not of scandal, but of scale. The Nile winding through fertile land, columns rising toward open sky, hieroglyphs etched with patient precision. Within that scale, individual stories unfold. Compelling, yes, but always part of something larger. Thank you for staying through this measured journey into the complexities behind the headline. If you appreciate history approached with balance and depth, subscribing supports more documentaries that favor context over sensationalism. Until our next exploration into the ancient world, we leave Egypt where it has stood for thousands of years, monumental, enduring, and far richer than any single dramatic phrase could ever convey. As we arrive at what will truly be the final reflection on this subject, it is fitting to step even further back and look not at individual rulers, but at time itself. Time is the great equalizer of reputations. It softens outrage, dulls scandal, and reshapes certainty into interpretation. Ancient Egypt, perhaps more than any civilization, demonstrates how time transforms narrative. Across 30 centuries of pharaonic rule, the image of kingship remained remarkably stable. The regalia did not change drastically. The iconography of divine association endured. The language of legitimacy persisted. Even when foreign dynasties took control, they adopted Egyptian royal titles and rituals. That continuity is powerful evidence. It suggests that the institution of kingship was stronger than any single personality attached to it. When certain pharaohs are remembered as excessive or controversial, it is usually because their reigns intersected with visible change. Change in any society creates tension. Tension invites interpretation. Interpretation often becomes moralized over time. The human mind prefers narratives where instability can be traced back to individual character. But historical reality is rarely that simple. Take once more the case of religious reform under Akhenaten. His elevation of the Aten disrupted long-standing temple networks and priestly influence. After his death, those networks were restored. Later tradition framed the period as aberrant. But from a structural perspective, what we observe is a moment of experimentation followed by institutional recalibration. That is not the mark of sustained decadence. It is the mark of a resilient system correcting itself. Similarly, the sibling marriages of the Ptolemaic rulers, often highlighted as extreme, reflected a deliberate strategy to reinforce dynastic continuity in a politically fragile environment. Within Egyptian theological logic, such unions were consistent with divine precedent. Within Greek cultural norms, they appeared unusual. When Roman authors later described these practices, they amplified their strangeness to serve political narratives. What began as strategy became spectacle in retelling. Even palace conspiracies, such as the one documented during Ramesses III's reign, illustrate procedural response rather than collapse. Surviving papyri record formal trials and sentences. The state reacted with bureaucracy. That detail matters. It shows that even amid internal tension, administrative order prevailed. There is also something profound about what the monuments choose not to show. Egyptian royal art is intensely curated. It emphasizes offering, victory, divine favor, and ritual performance. It does not dwell on indulgence or impropriety. While this selectivity does not prove the absence of controversy, it does reveal cultural priorities. Order and continuity were the public language of kingship. Modern audiences, conditioned by centuries of dramatic retelling, often inherit interpretations shaped by foreign observers. Greek and Roman writers framed Egypt through lenses of exoticism and contrast. Later European scholarship sometimes repeated those portrayals without fully disentangling their political context. Popular media, in turn, condensed layered narratives into striking headlines. Yet when we return to primary evidence, inscriptions, architecture, burial goods, administrative documents, we encounter a civilization defined by structure. Grain storage facilities reveal organized distribution systems. Worker settlements display coordinated labor management. Temple complexes reflect astronomical alignment and architectural planning. These are not the hallmarks of a society undone by unchecked excess. And so the most responsible conclusion is one of scale and proportion. Egypt's pharaohs were powerful figures occupying a sacred office that magnified their personal lives. Their marriages, heirs, and rituals were inseparable from statecraft. In moments of tension, those personal dimensions became focal points for broader anxieties. But those anxieties unfolded within a durable institutional framework. If scandal persists in memory, it is because it is memorable. But endurance is more revealing than memory alone. The Nile continued its cycle through every reign discussed here. The temples remained centers of ritual life. The scribes continued to record regnal years. That steady continuity tells a deeper story than any dramatic label. As we close this extensive documentary reflection at last, we are left not with a gallery of extremes, but with an appreciation for complexity. Ancient Egypt's rulers were neither flawless icons nor simple caricatures. They were human leaders navigating immense expectations within one of the most enduring political and religious systems ever created. Thank you for investing your time in this calm, long-form exploration. If thoughtful history grounded in evidence and proportion is what you value, subscribing supports more documentaries that favor clarity over spectacle. Until our next journey into the ancient world, we leave Egypt as it stands in stone and memory, vast, layered, and far richer than any headline could ever contain. As we let the final moments of this documentary settle, it's worth considering something subtle but essential. Civilizations are remembered in layers. The first layer is lived reality, the daily administration, the ritual cycles, the agricultural work, the court negotiations. The second layer is contemporary narrative, how rulers describe themselves in inscriptions and monuments. The third layer is later reinterpretation, how successors, rivals, and foreign observers retell what came before. By the time we encounter ancient Egypt today, we are often engaging with that third layer more than the first. The pharaohs most frequently described as extreme or controversial tend to occupy moments where those layers collided. A ruler introduces change. The immediate reaction is political and institutional. Later generations reinterpret that reaction in moral terms. Still later cultures, removed from the original context, amplify the moral framing into something more dramatic. But if we strip back those layers carefully, what we consistently find is a society oriented toward order. Egyptian kingship was not improvisational. It was ritualized. The coronation ceremony linked each new ruler to mythic origins. The king's titulary invoked divine protection. The annual festivals reaffirmed cosmic stability. These acts were not symbolic in a casual sense. They were foundational to how Egyptians understood reality itself. In such a system, deviation from tradition carried symbolic weight. That symbolic weight is what later storytellers often interpreted as personal flaw. Yet deviation can arise from many forces: economic necessity, religious evolution, diplomatic strategy, or even generational change within elite circles. To reduce it solely to moral indulgence flattens complexity. Consider how often accusations intensify when political power shifts hands. When a new dynasty emerges, it must legitimize itself. One method of legitimation is contrast. If the previous ruler can be framed as misguided or excessive, the new ruler appears corrective and stabilizing. Over time, that contrast hardens into historical memory. Foreign commentary adds another dimension. Greek writers encountered Egypt as an ancient, deeply ritualized society with customs that did not always align with Hellenic norms. Roman authors later encountered it as both rival and prize. In such contexts, highlighting perceived excess served rhetorical purpose. The portrayal of Egyptian courts as decadent reinforced external political identity. Modern retellings often inherit fragments of these portrayals without fully tracing their origins. A practice once described with cultural curiosity may, centuries later, be labeled with moral intensity. Yet the archaeological and textual record rarely supports sustained narratives of collapse driven by indulgence. Instead, it reveals administrative continuity, architectural ambition, and religious resilience. The temples that still stand along the Nile required logistical precision. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and aligned. Labor had to be organized and provisioned. Offerings had to be scheduled and recorded. These processes speak to coordinated governance. Even rulers remembered for controversy contributed to this continuity. And perhaps that is the final, steady insight. Ancient Egypt was defined more by systems than by scandals. Its rulers were individuals shaped by sacred expectation and political necessity. Some tested the boundaries of tradition. Some restored older forms. Some navigated foreign pressure. All operated within a civilization that valued balance above chaos. As we close this extended reflection for good, the image that remains is one of scale and stillness. The Nile flows, the desert preserves. The columns cast long shadows at sunset. Beneath those shadows, history endures not as headline, but as layered memory. Thank you for staying through this long-form exploration. If you appreciate calm, evidence-based storytelling that favors depth over drama, subscribing helps sustain more documentaries like this. Until our next journey into the ancient world, we leave Egypt where it has always stood, monumental, intricate, and far more nuanced than any sensational phrase could ever suggest. As we truly bring this subject to its final resting point, it is worth reflecting on how civilizations ultimately define themselves, not by their moments of controversy, but by what they choose to preserve. Ancient Egypt preserved order. It preserved ritual language. It preserved names in cartouches meant to endure for eternity. That act of preservation tells us something fundamental about its priorities. The pharaoh stood at the center of that preservation effort. His role was not merely political, it was cosmological. He ensured that the gods received offerings, that temples functioned, that justice was administered, that enemies were repelled. The rituals of kingship were repetitive by design, reinforcing continuity across generations. Even when a ruler introduced dramatic change, the vocabulary of divine legitimacy remained remarkably consistent. This continuity helps explain why sensational interpretations often feel disproportionate when weighed against the archaeological record. A civilization defined by systemic decadence does not maintain consistent temple construction for centuries. It does not produce administrative documents tracking labor assignments and resource distribution with careful precision. It does not sustain a unified religious iconography across vast stretches of time. When certain rulers are labeled as extreme, we are often witnessing the aftereffects of political recalibration. After Akhenaten's death, restoration required distancing from his theological experiment. After palace conspiracies, legitimacy required reassurance. After foreign intervention, cultural identity required reinforcement. In each case, narrative became a tool. Narrative is powerful because it compresses complexity. It assigns motive where there may have been structural pressure. It assigns flaw where there may have been adaptation. Over time, narrative can eclipse nuance. And yet nuance persists in stone. It persists in papyri. It persists in the alignment of temples to celestial events. It persists in the orderly layout of workers' villages. These tangible remnants speak quietly of coordination and resilience. They reveal a society that valued predictability and balance above spectacle. The fascination with moral extremes reflects a timeless human impulse. We seek to humanize power by imagining its vulnerabilities. But in ancient Egypt, vulnerability itself was ritualized. The king's mortality was acknowledged through elaborate burial preparation. His divine rebirth was scripted in funerary texts. Even death was folded into cosmic order. This perspective shifts the conversation. Instead of asking which pharaoh was most excessive, we begin asking how sacred monarchy functioned as a stabilizing force. Instead of isolating personal behavior from context, we see it embedded within political and theological expectation. Across 3,000 years, Egypt experienced droughts, invasions, succession disputes, and religious shifts. Yet it retained recognizable cultural coherence. That coherence suggests that the institution of kingship, however imperfect, operated within boundaries that preserved systemic continuity. As we close this long documentary reflection for the final time, what remains is not scandal, but structure. Not headline, but horizon. The Nile continues its measured cycle, indifferent to the rumors once whispered in palace corridors. The monuments stand, patient and silent, outlasting every reinterpretation. Ancient Egypt's rulers were complex individuals, yes, shaped by ambition, belief, rivalry, and responsibility. But they were also custodians of one of the most enduring political systems in human history. To understand them fully requires stepping beyond sensational framing and into the deeper architecture of their world. Thank you for investing your time in this extended exploration. If you value long-form history that prioritizes clarity, proportion, and evidence over spectacle, subscribing supports more thoughtful journeys like this one. Until our next deep dive into the ancient past, we leave Egypt as it truly endures, monumental, balanced, and far more intricate than any dramatic label could ever contain. As we allow the final echoes of this topic to fade, it may help to focus on something even more fundamental than reputation: scale. Ancient Egypt was vast in time, in geography, and in institutional memory. When we compress that scale into a single dramatic phrase about a handful of rulers, we inevitably distort proportion. The civilization itself operated on rhythms far slower and steadier than the pace of rumor. The Nile's annual flood did not depend on palace intrigue. Agricultural planning did not halt because of court controversy. Temple rituals continued in carefully scheduled cycles regardless of shifts in succession. These enduring rhythms remind us that the pharaoh, while central in symbolism, existed within a network of officials, priests, scribes, and laborers who sustained continuity across generations. This broader perspective reframes how we interpret moments of scandal or accusation. A palace conspiracy, for example, was not simply a tale of personal betrayal. It was a symptom of succession anxiety within a hereditary monarchy. A religious reform was not simply eccentric vision. It was a redistribution of ideological and economic authority. A dynastic marriage strategy was not merely private preference. It was a political calculation within sacred kingship. When later commentators, especially those outside Egypt, described these episodes with heightened moral intensity, they were often engaging in cultural comparison. To Greek and Roman observers, Egypt represented antiquity, ritual depth, and unfamiliar custom. Highlighting perceived excess helped define their own political identity in contrast. Over centuries, these portrayals became embedded in Western historical imagination. Modern audiences inherit that imagination, sometimes without realizing its layered origins. Dramatic labels resonate because they feel decisive. But decisive language can obscure the underlying mechanics of power. archaeology has gradually restored those mechanics to view. Excavations at sites like Amarna reveal administrative planning behind what once appeared as abrupt religious upheaval. Studies of workers' villages show regulated labor and wage systems. Analysis of burial goods demonstrates continuity of religious belief even across contested reigns. These findings complicate simplistic narratives of decadence or collapse. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to consider. Ancient Egypt conceptualized kingship as a divine office inhabited by a mortal body. That duality created inherent tension. The king was expected to embody perfection while remaining human. Any deviation from expectation could therefore be magnified symbolically. But magnification does not necessarily equate to moral catastrophe. It reflects the weight of symbolic expectation. When we remove the weight of later sensational framing, what remains is a civilization that valued stability. Stability in agricultural cycles, stability in ritual language, stability in artistic convention. Even periods of disruption were absorbed and reframed within that broader commitment to order. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath the headline. The most enduring civilizations are not those free from controversy, but those capable of integrating it without losing structural coherence. Egypt integrated change. It restored balance after reform. It adopted foreign dynasties into its sacred vocabulary. It maintained recognizable identity across immense spans of time. So as we finally conclude this long-form reflection, the image that lingers is not of excess, but of equilibrium. Colossal statues stand aligned with the horizon. Temple columns rise in ordered rows. Hieroglyphs march across stone in disciplined lines. Within that ordered world, individual lives unfolded, complex, contested, remembered. Thank you for spending this extended time exploring ancient Egypt through a lens of patience and proportion. If you appreciate thoughtful, in-depth history told without exaggeration, subscribing supports more documentaries that favor clarity over spectacle. Until our next journey into the past, we leave the pharaohs where history places them, at the center of a civilization defined not by scandal, but by remarkable endurance. As we reach what is truly the final closing reflection, it may be helpful to step entirely outside the language of accusation and consider legacy instead. Legacy is what survives when rumor fades. Legacy is what remains when politics cool and emotions settle. And in the case of ancient Egypt, legacy is carved in limestone, granite, and memory. When visitors stand before the pyramids at Giza, they are not thinking about palace gossip. They are witnessing engineering precision from nearly 4,500 years ago. When travelers walk through Karnak or Luxor, they encounter columns rising in deliberate alignment, inscriptions recounting offerings and victories, walls layered with centuries of additions. These structures required coordination, foresight, and long-term planning. They represent systems functioning across generations. That is not to deny that certain rulers sparked controversy. Some experimented with theology. Some faced internal intrigue. Some navigated foreign pressure in ways later observers found dramatic. But even in those cases, what endures materially is evidence of organized governance rather than collapse. Civilizations are fragile when they rely solely on individual charisma. They endure when they build institutions. Egypt built institutions, priesthoods with administrative networks, scribal schools transmitting literacy, agricultural management systems adapting to the Nile cycles, architectural traditions replicable across centuries. Pharaohs operated within those frameworks. They influenced them, certainly, but they did not exist apart from them. When later writers described particular pharaohs as morally extreme, they were often interpreting moments of transition. Transitions unsettle expectations. They create winners and losers. Those who lose influence sometimes frame change in moral terms. Over time, that framing can harden into reputation. Yet, if moral collapse truly defined these reigns, the archaeological record would show systemic disintegration. Instead, we often see recalibration. After Akhenaten's death, temple worship resumed. After palace conspiracies, succession stabilized. After foreign conquest, Egyptian religious symbolism persisted, even under new rulers. This pattern suggests that what we are really observing is not decadence, but resilience under strain. Resilience rarely makes for sensational headlines. It is gradual. It is procedural. It is embedded in continuity rather than spectacle. There is also something profound about how Egypt conceptualized time. Eternity was not abstract. It was central to religious belief. Tomb inscriptions sought to preserve names forever. Royal titulary linked each ruler to divine archetypes stretching back to mythic origins. Within that framework, momentary scandal would have seemed small compared to eternal order. Modern audiences, accustomed to rapid news cycles and dramatic revelations, sometimes underestimate how differently ancient societies experienced narrative. In Egypt, permanence mattered more than immediacy. The stone inscription outlasted the whispered accusation. And so, when we consider the so-called most controversial pharaohs, we must weigh what endures against what was said. What endures are temples, administrative texts, artistic conventions, and religious continuity. What was said, often by later observers, fluctuates across centuries. In the end, ancient Egypt's rulers were complex figures navigating sacred expectation and political reality. Some altered tradition, some reinforced it, some governed during turbulent eras. But none can be understood through a single dramatic phrase. As we close this extended documentary journey for good, the lasting image is one of proportion. The Nile flowing steadily past fields and temples, columns casting long shadows in the evening sun, hieroglyphs etched with careful precision. Within that measured landscape, history unfolds not as spectacle, but as structure. Thank you for staying through this long, deliberate exploration. If you value thoughtful, evidence-based storytelling that moves beyond sensational framing, subscribing supports more deep dives into the ancient world. Until our next journey, we leave Egypt where it stands in stone and memory, monumental, enduring, and far more nuanced than any headline alone could ever capture. As we truly let this topic settle into stillness, perhaps the most honest closing thought is this: history rewards restraint. The louder the headline, the more carefully we should listen for what lies beneath it. Ancient Egypt, with its immense chronological depth and monumental record, invites that restraint more than almost any other civilization. When we look across its dynasties, what we see most clearly is not indulgence, but continuity. The repetition of royal titulary, the persistence of temple ritual, the renewal of sacred architecture generation after generation. Even when regimes changed, when capitals moved, when foreign rulers assumed the throne, the language of kingship endured. That endurance speaks to a shared understanding of order that transcended individual reigns. The pharaoh was central to that order, but he was not its sole architect. Beneath him stood layers of administration. Viziers overseeing justice, scribes recording harvest yields, priests maintaining daily offerings, craftsmen shaping reliefs, laborers quarrying stone. These networks functioned with remarkable consistency. If a ruler had truly governed in sustained chaos or unchecked excess, those networks would have faltered in visible, systemic ways. The archaeological record rarely shows that pattern. Instead, what we observe is adaptation. Religious focus shifted, but iconography remained recognizable. Political power centralized, then decentralized, then centralized again. External pressure mounted, but cultural identity persisted. These are hallmarks of resilience rather than moral collapse. It is also worth reflecting on how the idea of scandal evolves over time. In many cases, accusations about rulers appear most vividly in sources written long after the events themselves. Later authors, writing in different cultural contexts, interpreted Egyptian practices through unfamiliar moral frameworks. What was once sacred symbolism could appear strange. What was strategic marriage could appear transgressive. The distance between observer and subject widened the gap between meaning and interpretation. Modern storytelling sometimes amplifies that gap because dramatic framing attracts attention. But sustained historical inquiry narrows it. It asks whether the evidence supports the intensity of the claim. It distinguishes between contemporary record and later commentary. It evaluates motive and context. And when that evaluation is applied consistently to Egypt's most controversial rulers, a pattern emerges: complexity without caricature. Akhenaten's reform was radical, but it unfolded within administrative planning. Ramesses III faced conspiracy, but legal procedure responded. The Ptolemies practiced sibling marriage, but within dynastic logic. Cleopatra formed alliances, but within geopolitical necessity. Each episode reveals political calculation embedded in sacred monarchy. Perhaps the most telling evidence lies not in words, but in stone. The temples remained active. The festivals continued. The tombs were prepared with meticulous care. These acts required stability and foresight. They required belief in continuity. So when we strip away the layers of later exaggeration, we are left with something steadier than scandal. A civilization deeply invested in maintaining balance. The concept of harmony, justice, right order was not decorative philosophy. It was operational principle. Pharaohs were measured by their ability to uphold it. As we conclude this long-form reflection at last, the enduring image is one of equilibrium. The Nile rising and falling with dependable rhythm. Columns aligned toward the sun. Hieroglyphs inscribed with disciplined precision. Within that framework, individual lives unfolded: ambitious, flawed, strategic, devout. Thank you for spending this extended time exploring ancient Egypt through a lens of proportion and patience. If you appreciate documentaries that prioritize evidence and clarity over sensational language, subscribing helps support more thoughtful journeys into the past. Until our next exploration, we leave the pharaohs where history ultimately places them, not as exaggerated figures of excess, but as complex custodians of one of the most enduring civilizations humanity has ever known. As we allow the final words of this long exploration to settle, it is worth ending not with a dramatic revelation, but with quiet clarity. The history of ancient Egypt is not sustained by scandal. It is sustained by structure. That distinction matters. For over 3 millennia, Egyptian kingship maintained a recognizable identity. Even when dynasties changed, even when foreign rulers adopted the throne, the symbolic language of power remained consistent. The crowns, the crook and flail, the cartouches enclosing royal names, these elements were repeated generation after generation. That repetition was deliberate. It reinforced the idea that the office of pharaoh transcended the individual who occupied it. When certain rulers are described in sensational terms, it is often because they intersected with moments of visible transformation. Religious reorientation under Akhenaten altered artistic and theological conventions. Succession tensions during the late New Kingdom exposed vulnerabilities within the palace. Hellenistic influence during the Ptolemaic era blended Greek and Egyptian traditions in ways that unsettled outside observers. Each moment generated commentary. Over time, commentary became narrative. Narrative became reputation. But reputation and reality are not always aligned. The archaeological record rarely supports the idea of sustained moral chaos at the top of Egyptian society. What it consistently reveals instead is administrative continuity. Taxation systems persisted. Labor forces were organized. Temple complexes were expanded. Trade networks adapted. Even in periods later described as unstable, daily life continued within structured frameworks. This is not to suggest that Egypt was free of tension or internal conflict. All complex societies experience both. But tension within a monarchy does not automatically equal decadence. Political rivalry does not inherently signal collapse. Religious reform does not inherently signal moral deviance. These phenomena are part of historical evolution. There is also something instructive about the way Egyptian civilization conceptualized permanence. Tombs were designed to secure eternity. Names were carved in stone to ensure remembrance. Kings were linked symbolically to gods whose cycles were eternal. Within that worldview, temporary controversy would have appeared small compared to cosmic continuity. Modern audiences, shaped by rapid media cycles and dramatic framing, may instinctively gravitate toward extremes. But the deeper story of Egypt resists that instinct. Its longevity speaks to balance. Its monuments speak to coordination. Its written records speak to order. Perhaps that is the final lesson embedded in this subject. The phrase that drew attention, "the most perverted pharaohs," belongs to the realm of narrative emphasis. But history, when examined patiently, belongs to proportion. It invites us to weigh evidence against interpretation. It asks us to recognize how memory evolves across centuries. In the end, ancient Egypt's rulers were neither flawless icons nor exaggerated villains. They were individuals navigating immense responsibility within a sacred political system. Their choices mattered because the institution magnified them. Their reputations shifted because later generations reframed them. As we truly close this extended documentary reflection, the image that remains is one of steadiness. The Nile flowing past cultivated fields. The desert preserving stone in patient silence. columns rising in symmetrical rows toward the open sky. Within that enduring landscape, history unfolds not as spectacle, but as structure. Thank you for staying through this long, deliberate journey. If you value calm, evidence-based storytelling that favors depth over drama, subscribing supports more thoughtful explorations like this one. Until our next venture into the ancient world, we leave Egypt as it stands in time, monumental, resilient, and far more nuanced than any single headline could ever capture. As we reach the final, quiet edge of this exploration, it becomes clear that the real subject was never scandal alone. It was power, memory, and endurance. Ancient Egypt endures not because it was sensational, but because it was structured. That structure is the lens through which every controversial reign must ultimately be viewed. For over 3,000 years, the office of pharaoh carried sacred weight. The king was more than a political ruler. He was the living embodiment of divine balance. His responsibilities were not abstract. They were woven into the agricultural cycle, the temple calendar, the legal system, and the cosmology of the people. When we examine rulers through that framework, personal stories become inseparable from institutional function. Moments of controversy, whether religious reform, palace intrigue, or unconventional marriage practice, gain visibility precisely because they appear against a backdrop of stability. Stability was the norm. Deviation was memorable. That memorability is often mistaken for dominance. Yet deviation does not define the system. It interrupts it. If Egypt had truly been defined by persistent moral excess at the highest level, its systems would have eroded. Agricultural management would have faltered. Temple hierarchies would have fractured irreparably. Monumental building projects would have ceased for extended periods. Instead, we observe remarkable continuity punctuated by adaptation. Consider the temples that still stand in Karnak and Luxor. They were not the work of a single reign. They were expanded, modified, and restored across centuries. Each generation added to what came before. That collaborative continuity is incompatible with the idea of sustained institutional decay driven by personal indulgence. Even rulers remembered for upheaval contributed to this layered inheritance. Akhenaten's period of reform altered artistic conventions, but the technical skill of artisans persisted. The late New Kingdom's internal tensions did not halt monumental inscription. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian iconography to reinforce legitimacy, demonstrating how deeply embedded the symbolic system had become. The fascination with labeling certain pharaohs as extreme reflects a timeless human tendency to personalize history. We seek clarity in characters. We assign cause to individuals. But ancient civilizations functioned through networks of belief and administration far larger than any one person. It is also important to recognize that many of the most dramatic portrayals of Egyptian rulers come from sources shaped by cultural distance. Greek and Roman authors encountered Egyptian practices through unfamiliar lenses. Their accounts, colored by political rivalry and cultural contrast, influenced later Western perceptions. Over centuries, those impressions hardened into assumption. Modern scholarship works carefully to untangle that inheritance. It compares contemporary Egyptian inscriptions with later narratives. It analyzes archaeological context. It evaluates motive. The result is not the elimination of controversy, but its recalibration within proportion. and proportion is what ultimately restores clarity. Yes, there were rulers whose decisions unsettled tradition. Yes, there were moments of intrigue and tension within palace walls. Yes, there were practices that appear startling to modern sensibilities. But none of these elements overshadow the larger arc of institutional endurance. Ancient Egypt was a civilization anchored in repetition, ritual repetition, artistic repetition, administrative repetition. That repetition created resilience. It absorbed innovation without dissolving identity. It corrected imbalance without abandoning structure. As we close this extended documentary reflection for good, what remains is not spectacle, but stillness. The Nile continues its cycle. The monuments endure under the sun. The carved names of pharaohs remain visible thousands of years later. Their reputations may fluctuate, but their place within history's broader architecture is secure. Thank you for spending this long, measured journey exploring the deeper layers behind dramatic framing. If you value thoughtful history that privileges context and evidence over exaggeration, subscribing supports more documentaries that aim for clarity rather than noise. Until our next exploration of the ancient world, we leave Egypt as it truly stands, enduring, intricate, and far more balanced than any sensational headline could ever suggest. As we truly reach the final still point of this long exploration, it is worth pausing not on controversy, but on continuity. Continuity is the quiet force that runs beneath all Egyptian history. It is visible in the repeated royal names, in the preservation of ritual language, in the consistent orientation of temples toward celestial markers. And it is continuity, not scandal, that ultimately defines the civilization. When we began with a provocative framing about the most controversial or perverted pharaohs, we entered through the doorway of curiosity. That doorway is powerful, captures attention, but once inside, the landscape changes. We discover that what appears sensational at first glance is often deeply embedded in political, theological, and dynastic logic. Ancient Egyptian kingship was a sacred office inhabited by mortal individuals. That combination guaranteed tension. Mortality carries limitation. Divinity demands perfection. The gap between the two creates narrative space. When a ruler introduced change, whether in religion, art, or marriage practice, that space widened. Later storytellers filled it, but storytelling evolves. A theological reform becomes eccentricity. A dynastic strategy becomes impropriety. A political alliance becomes seduction. These transformations do not necessarily reflect deceit. They reflect perspective. Perspective shifts across centuries, and memory shifts with it. Yet beneath shifting memory lies material evidence. Stone blocks cut and aligned with mathematical precision. Administrative records tracking labor and grain. Tomb paintings detailing ritual journeys through the afterlife. These materials are less dramatic than rumor, but far more stable. Egypt's endurance suggests that whatever personal controversies surrounded individual pharaohs, they unfolded within resilient systems. Temple economies did not dissolve overnight. Agricultural cycles did not collapse because of court intrigue. Even in periods of foreign rule, Egyptian iconography and ritual practice persisted, adapted, and continued. There is something instructive in that persistence. It tells us that institutions, when deeply rooted, can absorb turbulence. They bend, recalibrate, and reassert balance. The concept of harmony and order was not abstract philosophy. It was the organizing principle of governance. Pharaohs were judged by their capacity to maintain it. When they failed, they were remembered critically. When they succeeded, they were remembered reverently. But even criticism operated within the same symbolic vocabulary of order and restoration. Modern audiences, accustomed to rapid shifts in reputation and constant exposure of private life, may find it difficult to imagine a world where personal behavior was inseparable from sacred office. Yet that inseparability is key to understanding Egypt. The king's family life, fertility, alliances, and ritual acts were political statements. They were not hidden scandals. They were public components of governance. Over time, as cultural distance increased, those components were reinterpreted. Greek and Roman observers emphasized what felt foreign. Later Western narratives repeated and amplified those emphases. The result is a layered image that sometimes overshadows context. But context restores proportion. It reveals that Egypt's rulers were neither uniquely depraved nor uniquely virtuous. They were complex actors within an enduring system. Some reigns were turbulent. Some were prosperous. Some were innovative. Some were restorative. All were embedded in structures that valued balance. As we finally close this extended reflection, the lasting image is not of excess but of equilibrium. The Nile flowing with seasonal regularity. Temple columns casting ordered shadows at dusk. Hieroglyphs inscribed in careful rows. Within that world, pharaohs lived, ruled, and were remembered. Thank you for taking this long journey into the deeper layers behind a dramatic title. If you appreciate thoughtful, calm historical storytelling that favors depth over spectacle, subscribing supports more documentaries built on evidence and perspective. Until our next exploration of the ancient world, we leave Egypt as it stands in stone and time, enduring, complex, and far richer than any single provocative phrase could ever capture.